Hey there and welcome back. Settle yourself down now, as deep and as easy as you can manage, and let the weight of the day slide off you, because it is over and done with, and there is nothing left in it that has any claim on you tonight. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of day has brought you here, you are welcome, and you have nothing to do now but breathe slowly and let yourself be carried a long way off. Tonight, I want to take you to the far west of the Scottish Highlands, more than 100 years ago, in the first years of the 20th century, and put you aboard a little steam train on what was then the newest and the wildest railway in all of Britain for a single day's journey out to the very edge of the land, where the mountains at last run down into the sea. It is a journey of only some 40 miles, but they are 40 of the most beautiful and the most haunted miles in these islands, and by the time we reach the end of the line, at a small fishing harbour looking out toward the Hebrides, we will have crossed a great curving bridge flung impossibly across an empty glen, and run for hours through a country of breathtaking loveliness and almost total silence, a silence that hides a sorrow we will come to understand. And we will have passed, without most travellers ever quite knowing it, straight through the heart of the saddest and most romantic story in all of Scotland's long history. For at one lonely spot along this line, where a single stone figure stands forever, staring down a long dark loch, a young prince once stood and raised a flag and set in motion something that would end in glory and in ruin and break the Highlands forever. We will come to him and to that flag before the day is out. Before we climb aboard and the whistle blows, let me say the one quiet thing that belongs to our own time and not to the time we are going to, and then I will not break the spell again. If these slow journeys back into vanished places are a comfort to you, a way of setting down the day and drifting off towards sleep, then you would be most welcome to come wandering with me again on other nights like this one. There is no cost and no hurry to any of it. Only a standing invitation to travel back into history together whenever the need is on you. I always like to picture the great scattered company that comes along on these evenings, spread as you are across so many countries and so many hours of the night. So if you ever care to leave a word about which country you are lying in tonight, and which town or which quiet stretch of countryside, and what the hour has come to where you are, I look through those notes far more often than you might think, and there is a real and simple warmth in it for me, in knowing a little of who is out there in the dark, listening along. And now let us leave all of that behind, and go back more than 100 years, and step out onto a Highland platform in the cool of an early morning. Picture this. It is a soft grey morning in the late summer of about 1905, and we are standing on the platform of a small railway station in the little town of Fort William on the western edge of the Scottish Highlands, with the whole vast bulk of Ben Nevis, the highest mountain in all of Britain, rising into the clouds somewhere above and behind us. The air is cool and damp, and smells of coal smoke and salt water and wet hillside, of rain not long fallen and rain not far off, for this is a country where the weather is never still for long. Before us at the platform stands the train that is to carry us out to the coast, a short string of carriages behind a sturdy, gleaming little tank engine, its brass fittings polished, a thread of steam rising from it into the grey air. The whole thing looking very small against the immensity of the mountains all around. This is the West Highland line, and the stretch of it we are about to travel, out from Fort William to the sea at Mallaig, is the newest railway in the kingdom, opened only 4 years ago, in the spring of 1901. We are among the first generation of human beings ever to be able to make this journey by rail. Let us find our seats, and settle ourselves by a window, and wait for the off, while I tell you how this remarkable line came to be flung across one of the wildest corners of Europe at all. For you must understand, first of all, just what kind of country this railway was driven through, because there is nothing else quite like it in Britain, and the wonder of the line is inseparable from the wildness of the land. West of Fort William, the Highlands do not soften, as you might expect, toward the coast, and they grow, if anything, more savage and more beautiful the nearer they come to the sea. It is a country of bare grey mountains and black peat bog, of countless lochs and lochans lying like scraps of fallen sky among the heather, of tumbling rivers and dripping rock and tracts of ground so broken and so sodden that a man on foot might labour all day to cross a single mile of it. There were almost no roads worth the name, and almost no people, a few scattered crofting townships clinging to the shore, a few shepherds in the glens, and otherwise a great emptiness of mountain and water and sky stretching away to the Atlantic. To build a railway through such a country, men said, was next to impossible, and for many years it was not even seriously attempted. The land itself seemed to forbid it. And yet a railway was wanted here, wanted badly, and in the end it was the wanting that won. What was wanted, above all, was a way to carry fish. Out at the western edge of all this wilderness, on the open sea, lay rich fishing grounds, and along the coast lay little harbours where the herring came ashore in their silver thousands in the season, but with no railway and scarcely any roads. There was no quick way to get that catch to the great hungry cities of the south, to Glasgow and beyond, where it could be sold. The fish came ashore at the edge of the world, and had no swift way to leave it, and so much of the wealth of that sea was lost, and the people of the coast stayed poor. A railway run out to a good deep-water harbour on that coast would change everything. The morning's catch could be put aboard a train and rushed south overnight, to be sold fresh in the city markets while the boats that caught it were still out on the water. That was the dream, and it was a practical, hard-headed, money and fish sort of dream, and it was strong enough, in the end, to drive a line of iron through 40 miles of impossible country. The harbour they chose, at the far end of it all, was a little place called Mullegg, and it is there that we are bound today. The men who finally undertook to build it were a firm of contractors led by a remarkable Scotsman named Robert McAlpine, a self-made man risen from working as a bricklayer's boy to the head of a great construction business, and known up and down the country by a nickname that tells you exactly how he solved the problem of this impossible land. They called him Concrete Bob. For the rock of these mountains, a hard and stubborn grey stone called schist, was the wrong sort of rock for the old way of building, too awkward and too unyielding to be cut and dressed into the neat masonry blocks from which bridges had always been made. McAlpine's answer was to turn to a material that most builders of his day still distrusted, and looked down upon, mass concrete, poured wet into wooden moulds and left to set into artificial stone, taking up the shape of whatever it was poured into. Where other men saw only a cheap and ugly makeshift, McAlpine saw the one substance that could be made to work in this trackless country, mixed on the spot from the gravel of the riverbeds, needing no skilled stonemasons, able to be moulded into any shape the engineers could dream of. The whole line, every bridge and culvert and viaduct along its 40 miles would be built of the stuff. It was one of the first times in the world that concrete had been used on such a scale for such a purpose, and engineers as far away as America wrote about it in wonder. The building of it, between the years 1897 and 1901, was a feat of dogged human endurance that is hard now to imagine. An army of labouring men, the navvies, was brought into this remote and roadless wilderness and set to hack a level path for the rails through bog and rock and mountainside, by hand and by horse and by black powder in some of the foulest weather in Britain. It was brutally hard and dangerous labour, and we shall hear more of the men who did it a little further along. McAlpine drove the work on through every difficulty, his own sons toiling alongside him, one of them badly hurt in an accident on the line, and slowly, mile by stubborn mile, the impossible line crept westward through the mountains toward the sea. There is a saying that was current about the building of this railway, a verdict passed by one of the men who surveyed its impossible route, and it has the grim determination of the whole enterprise in it, that the line would have to go over the country, or under it, or round it, or through it, but go it must. And go it did. The greatest of all the structures along the line, the crowning achievement of McAlpine and his concrete, was a bridge we shall come to in good time, the bridge that carries the railway across a wide and lovely glen at a place called Glen Finnan, and you shall meet it properly when we reach it, for it deserves its own moment, and it will have it. There were others almost as bold, a great single concrete arch flung across a gorge that was, when it was built, the longest of its kind anywhere in the world, written up in the engineering journals of America as a marvel of the age. The whole line, in truth, was a marvel, a thread of iron and grey concrete laid by main force across a country that had defied the railway builders for a generation, opening up at last, to the wider world, a coast that had lain remote and half forgotten since the beginning of time. When it opened, in the spring of 1901, it was hailed as one of the engineering wonders of the kingdom, and it remains to this day one of the most beautiful railway journeys to be made anywhere on the earth. And we are about to make it. Listen, the guard is walking up the platform, the last doors are swinging shut, and away at the front the engine is getting up its steam. A whistle blows thin and clear in the damp morning air. There is a jolt, a hiss, a first slow grinding turn of the wheels, and then another, and another, and the platform of Fort William begins to slide gently backward past our window. We are away. The engine settles into its work, and the steady beat of it comes back to us, and the carriage begins to rock and sway in the easy, hypnotic rhythm that anyone who has ever travelled by an old train will remember in their very bones, the long roll, and the soft double knock of the wheels passing over the joints in the rails, again and again, a rhythm as regular and as soothing as a heartbeat. That will be our companion all the day long. Settle back into it now. Let the rhythm take you. Outside the window the last houses of Fort William fall away, and the great mountain at our backs is swallowed in its own grey cloud, and the line swings out along the side of a long sea lock, with the water lying still and silver below us, and ahead to the west, the country opens out wild and empty and beautiful beyond telling. The journey has begun. There is nothing now to do but sit by the window and watch the Highlands unfold, and listen, and let me tell you the story of this haunted and lovely land as we pass through it. As we run on through this wild country, spare a thought for the men whose labour put the very rails beneath us. Hear the navvies who built this line, for theirs is a story of human endurance that deserves to be remembered, and the deeper you understand what it took to drive a railway through this country, the more astonishing the smooth, easy run we are enjoying becomes. They came in their hundreds, these labouring men, drawn from all over Scotland and Ireland and beyond by the promise of work, into a wilderness with no towns and no roads and no shelter and no comfort of any kind, and they were set to build, by the strength of their backs and arms, a level road for the railway across a country that did everything in its power to stop them. Where there was rock, they had to blast it and break it and carry it away. Where there was bog, they had to drain it or fill it or bridge it, sometimes tipping in countless tons of rock that simply vanished into the depths before the bog was tamed. Where there was a river or a gorge or a glen, they had to throw a bridge across it. And all of this by hand, with pick and shovel and barrow and black powder and the muscle of men and horses, in a country and a climate that fought them every single day. And what days they were! The rain of the west fell on them without mercy, week upon week, soaking them to the skin as they worked, turning their diggings to rivers of mud, their camps to quagmires. In the summer the midges came, those tiny biting flies that rise in maddening clouds from the wet Highland ground in their countless millions and can drive a man half out of his wits. The work itself was savage and dangerous. Rock falls, premature explosions, the crushing weight of materials, the 100 ways that heavy labour in a wild place can maim and kill. Men died building this line, as men died building every great railway of that age and were buried, some of them in the lonely country they had come to tame. They lived in rough wooden huts strung out along the works, far from their families, far from any town, in a comradeship of hard men doing hard things in a hard place. And the contractor, Concrete Bob McAlpine, was out among them through it all, driving the work forward. And so remote and so dangerous was the whole enterprise that a small hospital had to be set up in the wilderness, simply to deal with the steady toll of injured men. These navvies were the foot soldiers of the great age of railway building, and there were armies of them, moving across Britain, and indeed across the world, from one great labour to the next, throwing up the embankments and boring the tunnels and raising the viaducts that knit the modern world together. They were rough men, many of them, hard living and hard drinking, looked at askance by the respectable folk of the districts they passed through, but they were also men of immense strength and skill and courage, who did, with their bare hands and their simple tools, labour of a scale and a difficulty that can scarcely be believed, and who left behind them, when they moved on, the bridges and the lines that still carry us today. Every time our train sweeps round a curve cut from the living rock, or rolls across an embankment raised from the bog, or crosses one of McAlpine's great concrete arches, we are riding upon the frozen labour of those vanished men, the sweat and the danger, and sometimes the lives that they poured into this ground. It is right to remember them, because it is so very easy to forget them. We ride in comfort over their work, and never think of the cost of it. Never picture the soaked and muddy men who broke this road through the mountains in the rain a few years before. The line seems so natural now, so much a part of the country, that you would think it had always been here. And yet every yard of it was wrung out of the wilderness by human toil within living memory, by men whose names are nearly all forgotten now, who have left no monument but the railway itself. Let the railway be their monument then. As we run on so smoothly toward the sea, on the road that they built, let us give the navvies of the West Highland line their due, and remember that this beautiful journey, like so many good things, was bought with the hard labour of forgotten men. And now let us look out again at the wild country, their labour opened up, and travel on into the heart of it. For a while we simply run westward and a little north, along the shore of the long sea loch, and the country reveals itself slowly through the carriage window, and it is like nothing else in Britain. The tame and tended landscape of the south, the hedged fields and the snug villages, is utterly gone. What we have instead is wilderness, real wilderness, on a scale that the rest of the island long ago lost. Bare mountains rise on every side, their summits lost in trailing cloud, their flanks a patchwork of green bracken and purple heather and grey naked rock, scarred by white threads of falling water. Between them lie the lochs, sheets of dark still water that mirror the moving sky. The ground is a wild confusion of bog and boulder and tussock, dotted with the small wind-bent trees that are all that will grow in the teeth of the Atlantic gales. And over it all hangs an enormous brooding stillness, a silence so deep that even the steady beat of our own engine seems a small and impertinent sound within it. Now and then a red deer lifts its head from the heather to watch us pass. High overhead a great bird that may be an eagle hangs motionless on the wind. But of human beings, of houses, of farms, of any sign at all that people live in this country, there is almost nothing to be seen. We are running through one of the emptiest lands in Europe. And here we come to the first of the two great sorrows that lie beneath the beauty of this country, the thing you would never guess from the loveliness of it. And it is this, that the emptiness is not natural, and it is not old. This land was not always so silent. Not so very long before our train ever ran, within the memory of old people still living in 1905, these glens held people, and plenty of them. Up the side of nearly every one of these green valleys, if you knew where to look, you would find the low grassy mounds and tumbled stones that are all that is left of the little townships where Highland families had lived and worked the land for countless generations, in the old way, under their clan chiefs, a whole society of folk with their own language and their own music and their own fierce attachment to these very hills. And then, across the long, bitter years of the previous century, they were swept away. The chiefs, grown greedy or grown poor or simply grown careless of the folk who had always looked to them, discovered that sheep paid better than men. And so the families were put out of the glens, their roofs pulled down and burned over their heads, their families turned off the land their ancestors had held since before memory, to make room for great flocks of sheep. It is a thing called the clearances, and it is one of the saddest chapters in the whole history of these islands. Where did they go, all those cleared people? Some went down to the coast, to scratch a living from the sea on patches of ground too poor to feed them. Some went to the growing cities of the lowlands, to Glasgow and Greenock, to be swallowed up in the mills and the slums. And very many in the end went overseas aboard the emigrant ships, away across the Atlantic to Canada and to the Americas, or further still to begin again in a new and distant land, leaving behind them forever the glens that had borne them. They went, very often, with breaking hearts. There are accounts of whole shiploads of Highland immigrants standing at the rail and singing the old Gaelic songs of their lost home as the coast of Scotland sank below the horizon for the last time. And the glens they left behind fell silent, and the sheep grazed where the children had played, and the little townships crumbled slowly back into the hillside, and the great brooding emptiness that we are travelling through now came down over the land and never lifted. So when you look out of this window at all this heartbreaking, lonely beauty, understand what you are seeing. The silence out there is not peace. It is absence. It is the quiet of a country that has lost its people and is grieving for them still. It is one of the deep ironies of the very railway we are riding on that it was built in part as a kind of answer to all this loss, a lifeline thrown to a country bled almost white. The men who promoted the line spoke of it as a way to bring new life and new trade to the emptied West, to give the few who remained along the coast a way to make a living and a reason to stay, to stop the long hemorrhage of people from the Highlands. Whether a railway could ever truly heal so deep a wound is another question, and a hard one. But there is something fitting, all the same, in the thought of this bright modern line of steam and steel being driven through the silent glens as an act of hope, a refusal to let the country die altogether. And as we run on westward through the emptiness, let us hold that small, hopeful thought against the sadness of the cleared land, and travel on. For there is much more of this wild country to cross before we reach the famous places of the line, and much still to see and to tell as the train carries us deeper and deeper into the west. It is worth pausing, as we run on through all this overwhelming scenery, to wonder how such a country came to be, how these mountains were raised and these glens carved and these long locks hollowed out. For the shape of the land we are crossing is the labour of forces so vast and so unhurried and so ancient that the mind can scarcely take their measure, and there is a strange quiet peace in the contemplation of them. The rocks of these highlands are among the oldest in all the world, formed and folded and thrust up unthinkable ages ago, in times so remote that there was as yet no life upon the land at all, only the bare stone and the sea. And the mountains we see, worn and rounded as they are are the ancient roots and stumps of far greater mountains, once as high as any on earth, ground down across hundreds of millions of years, to the weathered hills that remain. To look at these old grey rocks is to look back almost to the beginning of the world, at something that was old beyond imagining before the first living thing crept out of the sea, that will be here, in some form, long after the last of us is gone. But the particular shape of the country, the deep glens and the narrow winding lochs and the smoothed and scoured and hollowed look of it all, is the doing of something more recent, though still unthinkably old by the measure of a human life. Not so very far back as the earth counts time, this whole country lay buried beneath a vast thickness of ice, a great frozen sheet that covered all the Highlands and ground its patient way down the valleys for age upon age, gouging and scouring and carving the soft rock away, deepening the glens, hollowing out the basins that the lochs now fill, smoothing and rounding the mountains, plucking and polishing the bare rock, until it had shaped the whole land into the forms we see today. The deepest of the lochs, like the great cold trench of Loch Morar that lies ahead of us near the coast, were carved by that ice far below the level of the sea. The straight glens are the tracks the glaciers followed. The very stones and boulders scattered across the moors were dropped where they lie by the melting ice, as it at last withdrew. We are travelling through a landscape made by ice, a country still bearing everywhere, to the seeing eye, the marks of the great cold that shaped it. There is something steadying, I find, in holding all this in the mind, here amid the rush of our own brief human concerns, the immense age of the rocks, the patient grinding work of the ice, the vast unhurried processes that raise these mountains and carve these glens across spans of time beside which the entire history of mankind, the whole tale of the prince and the clans and the railway and all our small doings, is less than the blink of an eye. The land was here, in something like this form, long before the first gale, ages before the first man of any kind. It watched the saints come, and the clans rise and fall, and the people come and be cleared away, and the railway creep across it, with the same vast geological indifference, the same deep, unhurried patience, and it will be here, but worn a little further down, when all of that is forgotten. To rest the mind on that great age and that vast patience, as we run on through the gathering evening, is a profound and curious comfort, a setting of our small troubles against the vast calm measure of the earth. And it is a good thing to carry towards sleep, the sense of the ancient steadfast land holding us, and all our brief concerns, safe in its vast and patient keeping. You cannot travel this country, even for a single day, without becoming aware of the sky, for the weather of the Western Highlands is a living, restless, ever-changing presence, and it shapes the whole feel of the land beneath it. This is one of the wettest corners of Europe, where the warm, wet air rolling in off the Atlantic piles up against the first high mountains it meets and lets fall its endless burden of rain. And so the rain is the great fact of life here, soft grey curtains of it drifting across the hills, soaking the bog, swelling the rivers, dripping from every leaf and ledge, falling and falling for days on end, until the whole world seems made of water. Our own morning began grey and damp, as so many mornings here do, with the cloud lying low on the mountains and the rain not far off. But the weather of the west is never still, and it is never grey for long all through. It moves, and it breaks, and it changes from hour to hour and from minute to minute, so that a day here may hold within it every kind of weather there is. And when the change comes, when the wind shifts and the cloud begins to break, the transformation is something to behold. Watch through our window as it happens. A rent appears in the leaden ceiling. A shaft of sunlight comes slanting down through it, and where it falls upon the dark hillside, a patch of the land lights up suddenly in impossible greens and golds, glowing as though lit from within, while all around it the mountains stay dark, under the cloud. The wet rock gleams. The locks that were leaden a moment ago turn to sheets of beaten silver and then to blue. Somewhere across the glen, where the sun is shining through the falling rain, a rainbow springs up, a whole perfect arch of it, brighter and nearer than any rainbow of the soft south, and sometimes a second arch above the first. For this is the land of rainbows, and you may see a dozen in a single Highland day. The light comes and goes, racing across the mountains as the clouds race overhead, so that the whole landscape is never the same from one moment to the next, forever shifting between shadow and dazzling brightness. And then there is the great gift of these northern latitudes in the summer months, the length of the days, the lingering, reluctant, luminous Highland evenings that seem as though they will never end. So far north in summer, the sun is in no hurry to set, and the daylight stretches on and on into what would elsewhere be the night. And there comes in the late evening a long magical hour, the gloaming, when the light goes soft and golden and almost unbearably tender, lying low and level across the hills and the water, gilding everything it touches, before fading at last by imperceptible degrees into a brief and silvery dusk. It is in that long golden evening light that this country is at its most beautiful and its most haunting, and it is into that light that we are travelling as the day goes on, for our journey to the coast will bring us out at the sea's edge in the very best of the gloaming, with the long light lying gold upon the water and the islands floating in the haze. But that is still some way ahead. For now the weather plays over the mountains, sun and shower and rainbow chasing one another across the glens, and we run on through the heart of it all, dry and easy in our rocking carriage, watching the great show of the Highland sky. For all that the clearances emptied this country of its people, it is very far from being empty of life, and a watchful eye at the carriage window will be rewarded, as we pass, with glimpses of the wild creatures to whom these mountains truly belong. The greatest of them, and the one you are likeliest to see, is the red deer, the monarch of these hills, who has the run of all this wilderness now that the people are gone. You will catch sight of them on the high slopes, a group of hinds grazing the heather, lifting their heads to watch the train go by, or, if you are lucky, a great antlered stag standing proud upon a skyline, master of his domain. These beasts are the reason that much of this country is now kept as it is, for the wild Highland glens have become great sporting estates, deer forests as they are called, though there is scarcely a tree upon them, where wealthy men pay handsomely for the right to come north and stalk the stags across the hill. And that sport, grim though some find it, is now one of the few sources of money and employment in the cleared land, so that the stags have, in a manner, inherited the glens from the people who were driven out to make way for sheep, and the sheep in their turn from the deer. Lift your eyes higher, to the crags and the open sky above the mountains, and you may see the greatest of the Highland birds. The buzzard is common, wheeling and mewing over the hillsides on broad ragged wings. But with fortune on your side you may see, riding the wind high above the peaks, the eagle himself, the golden eagle, the king of British birds, soaring on wings that span the better part of a man's height, hanging almost motionless on the updraughts with the lazy mastery of a creature that fears nothing in all that sky. To see an eagle, even once, even far off, is to feel a kind of awe, a sense of having glimpsed something ancient and wild and utterly free. And there are others, the raven tumbling and croaking over the crags, the wild goat on the rocks, the salmon and the sea trout running up the rivers from the sea, the otter along the loch shores, and as we come down toward the coast, the seals that will haul out on the rocks and watch us with their strange, soft human eyes, and the seabirds wheeling in their thousands. There is a deep consolation in all this teeming wild life, set against the human sorrow of the empty glens. For though the people are gone, the land itself is not dead. It has simply returned in their absence to an older and wilder order, the order it knew before ever men came to dwell in it, and it goes on, indifferent and magnificent, living its own vast, slow life of deer and eagle and salmon and seal beneath the changing sky. There is something almost healing in it, in the thought that the beauty and the life of this country endure, whatever befalls the people who have loved it and lost it. The glens that grieve for their vanished children are at the same time alive with deer, and loud with birdsong, and bright with the leaping of fish, and the eagle keeps his ancient watch over all of it, as he did 1,000 years before the prince ever came up the loch, and as he will, no doubt, 1,000 years after our little train and all its passengers are forgotten. Watch for him on the high wind as we pass. He is worth the watching. We have spoken of the deer upon the hills and of the sportsmen in our carriage come north to stalk them, and it is worth understanding a little more of what has become of this great empty country in the years since the people were cleared from it, for the land we are passing through, that looks so wild and so free, is in truth nearly all of it owned and used in a particular way that tells its own story of the modern Highlands. Most of these vast tracts of mountain and moor are now great sporting estates, owned by wealthy men, very often men with no old connection to the country at all, industrialists and financiers and noblemen from the south or from further afield, who have bought up the depopulated glens not to live in or to farm, but to keep as private wildernesses for the pursuit of game. In the autumn they come north, these owners and their guests, to the great shooting lodges built in the lonely glens, to stalk the red deer across the hills, to shoot the grouse upon the moors, to fish the salmon in the rivers and lochs. And for a few weeks the empty country fills with the sound of the guns and the comings and goings of the sporting parties, before falling silent again for the rest of the year. It is a strange afterlife for the cleared glens, this, that the very emptiness which the clearances created, the emptiness bought at such a cost of human suffering, should have become in the new age a thing of value in itself, a luxury, a playground for the rich prized, precisely for its wildness and its solitude and its lack of people. The sheep that replaced the people proved in many places less profitable than had been hoped, the hills overgrazed and failing, and so the sheep in their turn gave way across much of this country to the deer, and the sheep farm to the deer forest. And the glen that had once held a thriving township of families now held nothing but the deer, and for a few weeks a year the men who came to shoot them. There is a bitter irony in it that the folk of the Highlands have never failed to feel, that their ancestral land, from which their own grandparents were driven in poverty and grief, should now be preserved as an empty wilderness for the pleasure of strangers, its emptiness no longer a tragedy but an amenity, the silence of the cleared glens sold at a high price to those who wish to hunt in solitude. And yet, as with the railway, the truth is not all of one colour, for the sporting estates, whatever else may be said of them, do bring some money and some employment into a country that has desperately little of either. The few people who remain on these shores find work as keepers and stalkers and ghillies and servants on the estates, guiding the sportsmen, managing the deer, tending the lodges, and the wages of that work and the money the visitors spend are a real, if a slender thread of life for the communities of the coast. It is not the old life, not the warm, thronged world of the clans and the townships. It is a thin and a dependent, and in some ways a humbling thing, that the descendants of the proud old kindreds become the servants of strangers on their own ancestral land. But it is a living of a kind, and in a country with so few livings left, it cannot be lightly dismissed. So the deer have the glens, and the rich have the deer, and the few remaining people have the crumbs of it, and the great, empty, beautiful country rolls by our windows, owned and ordered, and put to its strange new use, its old life gone, its future precarious, its silence sold, and over it all the eagle wheels, indifferent, as he did when the clansman held these glens, and as he will when the sportsmen too are gone. There is an old and lovely name for the way we are travelling, a name far older than the railway, and it is worth knowing, for it carries in it the whole long history of how men and beasts have moved through this country across the centuries. They call it the Road to the Isles. It is the name of the ancient route that runs west from the heart of the Highlands out to this coast, to the little ports from which the boats cross to the Hebrides, the Isles. And there is a famous old song of that name, a marching song full of the place names of this very country, of the longing of the exile far away for the road that leads home to the west, by the locks and the bens and the sea. For long ages before any railway, this was a hard road indeed, a matter of rough tracks, and drove paths winding through the passes, of fording rivers and skirting bogs, of long days on foot, or on a shaggy Highland pony, through some of the most difficult country in Britain. To come from Fort William to the coast in the old days was a serious undertaking of several days, not the easy morning's run that we are making now. The great traffic of that old route, for centuries, was cattle. The Highlands bred vast numbers of small black cattle, and since there was little enough else by which the people could make money, those cattle were driven, on the hoof, in great herds, all the weary way south to the markets of the lowlands and even of England, by the drovers, hardy men who walked the beasts hundreds of miles across the mountains, sleeping out on the hill wrapped in their plaids, living on oatmeal and whiskey and the milk of the cattle, following the old drove tracks that are written all across this country for those who can read them. It was a wild, free, arduous life, the life of the drover, and it was one of the great threads that held the old Highlands together, binding the remote glens to the wider world by these slender moving lines of men and cattle flowing south, year after year. The coming of the railways, in the end, killed the droving tradestone dead, for it was far quicker and easier to send the beasts south by train, and so our line, and others like it, swept away that ancient way of life even as it opened the country up, as the new so often sweeps away the old. And before the drovers, this road to the Isles carried stranger traffic still. It bore the marching clansmen going to war and coming home from it. It knew the messengers and the fugitives, and once, as we have heard, a hunted prince fleeing through these passes with the soldiers at his heels. It saw the cattle raiders, the broken men, the pilgrims bound for the holy places of the West. It carried in the bitter time the cleared people on the first stage of their long, sad journey to the emigrant ships. The whole history of the Highlands has flowed, at one time or another, along this old highway to the west, and now, in our own age, it carries us, in our warm, dry carriage with the steam blowing back past the windows, swiftly and easily over ground that cost the men of old such labour and such pain to cross. We are the heirs of all those travellers, the drovers and the clansmen and the prince and the exiles, riding the newest and the easiest version of their ancient road, and it is worth a moment, as we run on so comfortably toward the sea, to think of all the weary feet that went before us along the road to the Isles, and to feel the long history of it under our wheels. Let me tell you, while we run, about the engine that is doing all the work up ahead of us, and the two men who serve it, because they are as much a part of this journey as the mountains and the history, and theirs is a life worth understanding. Up at the front, beyond the carriages, the locomotive labours on, a compact and powerful little engine of the kind these steep and twisting Highland lines demand, that grip the curves and haul a train up the long gradients without ever being able to run very fast. Within its iron belly a fire is burning, a fierce roaring fire of coal, heating the water in the boiler to make the steam that drives the wheels, and on the open footplate behind the boiler stand the two men who make the whole thing go, the driver and the fireman, riding exposed to all the weather, the rain driving in upon them, the heat of the firebox at their backs. The fireman's work is ceaseless and brutally hard. Shovelful after shovelful of coal swung from the tender into the white heart of the fire, the right amount in the right place at the right moment all the way along the line, so that the steam never fails on the climbs. The driver stands at his controls with his hand on the regulator, reading the road ahead, easing his engine round the curves, opening her out on the straights, working the brakes against the falling gradients, knowing every yard of the line by heart. It is a hard life, and a proud one, and there is a deep skill in it that the passengers riding in comfort behind seldom think about. To take a heavy train safely along a line like this one, through all its curves and gradients and weathers, day after day, asks for judgment and nerve and an intimate loving knowledge of the engine and the road. The men who did it were the aristocrats of the railway working world, and they knew it. A driver on a Highland express carried himself with a quiet dignity that no duke could better, and there was a real bond between a man and his engine, for the locomotives of those days were not the identical mass-produced machines of a later age, but individuals, each with its own character and its own little ways, handed often to the same crew to learn and to nurse and to cherish. The fireman, learning his trade at the driver's elbow, would in time become a driver himself and take an engine of his own. It was a whole world, the world of steam, with its own crafts and its own pride and its own deep romance. And we are riding, today, in the very heart of its great age, when the steam engine was the master of the land and the fastest thing that most people had ever known. Listen to the beat of her up ahead, steady and strong, carrying us on into the west. There are good men on that footplate, soaked and sweating, and entirely sure of their work, and we are safe in their hands. And what of our own carriage and the company we keep in it? Look about you, for the people travelling this line in the early years of the century are worth seeing, and they are not at all the crowd you would find on a train in the south. The carriages themselves are simple and sturdy, panelled in varnished wood, with hard buttoned seats and a long mirror and a faded photograph of some Highland beauty spot above the seat backs, and a leather strap to let the window down, and a rack overhead piled with the bundles and baskets and boxes of country travellers. The compartment smells of pipe smoke and damp wool, and the particular mustiness of an old railway carriage. And the people. There is an old crofting woman with a shawl over her head and a basket of eggs on her knee, going to visit a daughter down the line, who has perhaps never in her life been further than the next parish until this railway came. There is a shepherd with his dog lying at his feet, the dog's eyes following every movement, the man's face brown and creased as old leather from a lifetime on the open hill. There are one or two fish buyers and merchants in town clothes bound for the harbour on business, talking prices in low voices. And there are too the first of a new kind of traveller, the kind that this very railway has begun to bring into the Highlands. The visitors, the sightseers, the sportsmen down from England and the south, come to shoot the deer and the grouse on the great Highland estates, or simply to gaze upon the famous scenery that the line has opened up. They sit a little apart in their tweeds and their good boots, with their fishing rods and their gun cases and their guidebooks, exclaiming at the views, and the local people regard them with a mixture of shrewd amusement and quiet economic calculation. For these visitors, whatever else may be said of them, bring money into a poor country. It is a strange and telling mixture of humanity to find sharing one small Highland railway carriage, the old world of the Gaelic-speaking crofter and shepherd, whose people have been on this land time out of mind, and the new world of the moneyed tourist for whom this wild country is a holiday and a spectacle. And the railway that carries them both is the very thing that is bringing the one world to the other, for good and for ill. Sit quietly among them, and listen to the soft Highland voices and the murmur of talk, and watch the country roll by, as the train carries this little gathering of souls on toward the sea. Every so often the train slows, and the brakes come on with a long sigh, and we draw to a stand at one of the little stations strung out along the line, and these too are worth a moment of your attention, for they are some of the most remote and lonely railway stations in all of Britain. A short stone platform, a tidy stone station building with a steep roof and the name of the place on a board, a signal or two, perhaps a siding with a wagon standing in it, and all around, in every direction, nothing but mountain and moor and water and sky, with maybe a single white croft house visible far off across the glen, and otherwise no sign of human habitation at all. The station master comes out to meet the train, immaculate in his uniform and his peaked cap, the lord of his tiny lonely kingdom, often the only railwayman for miles, and he and the guard exchange a word, and a parcel is handed down, and then the old woman with the eggs is helped to the platform, and perhaps a single passenger climbs aboard, and then we are away again into the wilderness. To be the keeper of one of these solitary Highland stations was a strange and isolated life, far from any town, the days marked out by the passing of a handful of trains, the hours of silence between them filled with the tending of the lamps and the garden and the small endless business of the line. There is a particular way that a single-track railway through wild country like this has to be worked, to keep the trains from ever meeting each other head-on upon the one line of rails, and there is something deeply reassuring in the carefulness of it. Only one train may be upon any given stretch of the single line at a time, and a driver may not enter that stretch unless he is carrying a particular token, a metal tablet or staff. That is his unique permission to be there, and since there is only one such token for each stretch, and he cannot get it without the one for the opposite direction being safely locked away, two trains can never be loosed against each other on the same metals. At the passing places, the stations with a loop of double track, the tokens are exchanged, handed up to the driver in a great hoop that he can catch on his arm without stopping, and so the trains thread their careful way past one another, along the single thread of the line, each one always certain of a clear road ahead. It is a quiet, ingenious, deeply human system, worked by watchful men in lonely places, through every hour and every weather, and it is part of why you may sit back in your seat without a care, and trust the line, and watch the mountains pass, and let your thoughts drift where they will. The train slows a little as the gradient steepens, the engine labouring now against the climb, its beat growing deeper and harder as it lifts us up toward the head of a broad and beautiful glen, and then the line begins to curve, a long, graceful, sweeping curve to the right, and as it does the ground simply falls away beneath us, and we find ourselves riding out, impossibly, into thin air, high above the floor of the valley, carried across the whole wide mouth of the glen on a curving bridge of pale grey arches that seems to hang between the mountains. This is the Glenfinnan Viaduct, the masterpiece of the whole line, the crowning work of concrete Bob McAlpine, and to cross it is one of the great experiences of railway travel anywhere on the earth. There are 21 arches beneath us, each one a tall and graceful semicircle, marching in a long curve across the glen. The whole span runs to very nearly a quarter of a mile, and we are riding 100 feet above the river that winds along the valley floor below. It is built, every yard of it, of McAlpine's mass concrete poured arch by arch into its wooden moulds in the reign of those building years, and it has stood here perfect and unshaken since the day it was finished, and it will stand, by the look of it, for 1,000 years to come. Lean to the window now, as the train eases its way around the curve, slow enough that you can take it all in, and look at what opens out before you, because it is one of the most beautiful prospects in all of Scotland. Below us and ahead, the glen runs down toward a great body of dark water, a long sea arm of a loch called Loch Shiel, that stretches away from the foot of the viaduct into the far blue distance, mile upon mile, winding off between steep flanking mountains, until it is lost in the haze of the horizon. The water lies utterly still in the grey light, mirroring the hills. Wooded slopes come down on either side. There is not a house, not a road, not a living soul to be seen in all that immense and silent prospect. Only the water and the mountains and the enormous sky, and our own small train creeping like a toy across the high arches with its thread of steam unravelling behind it. It is the kind of view that silences people, that makes them forget for a moment to speak. And then, as your eye travels down the loch, it catches on the one human thing in all that wilderness. Down at the head of the water, on a little point of land where the loch begins, there stands a tall, slender stone tower, and on the very top of it, tiny at this distance but unmistakable, the figure of a single man. He stands quite alone down there at the water's edge, that stone figure on his pillar, dressed in the old Highland fashion in kilt and plaid, and he is gazing out with a kind of endless patience down the length of the long loch toward the distant mountains and the sea beyond them, as though he were watching for something or someone that has been a very long time in coming. He has stood there, watching, for the better part of a century already as our train goes by. He stands there yet, in our own day, watching still. He is the loneliest-looking figure you could imagine, set down in all that emptiness with the great hills around him and the silent water at his feet. And there is something in his patient, solitary vigil that catches at the heart even before you know the first thing about him. But he is not there by chance, and he is not watching for nothing. That tower and that lonely Highlander mark one of the most important spots in the whole history of Scotland, the place where a story began that we have been circling toward since the very start of our journey. For this quiet green meeting of glen and loch, that looks today like the emptiest and most peaceful place on earth, was once, for a single extraordinary afternoon, the centre of the world. It was here, at Glenfinnan, on an August day 160 years before our train ever ran, that a young man came up that long loch in a small boat and raised a flag and lit a fire that would burn across the whole of Britain. Let the train carry us on across the viaduct, and let me tell you who he was. Before we leave Glenfinnan and the long loch behind us, let me draw your eye once more to that great sheet of dark water stretching away to the southwest, Loch Shiel, for it holds a secret far older even than the Jacobite story, older than the clans, reaching back into the very dawn of Christian Scotland, and it deepens the strange holiness of this place. Far down the loch, miles from where our train is crossing, there lies a small green island, and upon that island stand the grey ruins of an ancient chapel and the stones of an old burial ground. The island takes its name, and the loch takes its name, and the whole glen of Glenfinnan takes its name from a saint called Finan, one of the company of Celtic holy men who came over from Ireland more than 1,000 years ago, in the early ages of the faith, to carry Christianity into the wild glens and islands of the western Highlands. Finan made his cell on that lonely green isle in the loch, and prayed there, and taught the people of these shores, and there he is remembered still, and for century upon century after his death, the folk of all the country round about brought their dead to be buried on his holy island, rowing the coffins down the long loch in boats to lay them to rest in the saint's keeping. Think of that as you look down the silent water. For more than 1,000 years, in this glen that seems so empty and so silent now, there has been prayer, and there has been burial, and there has been the long, quiet faithfulness of ordinary people living and dying along these shores, and carrying their loved ones to the green isle at the last. The very name the prince's gathering place bears, Glenfinnan, the Glen of Finan, recalls that gentle saint of 1,000 years before, so that when Charles Edward Stuart chose this spot to raise his standard, he chose, without perhaps knowing it, a place already ancient and already holy, already heavy with 10 centuries of Highland faith and Highland dead. The clans who gathered to him here would all have known the green Isle of the Dead down the loch, would have had their own people buried there. They raised their flag of war on holy ground. There is an old bell, they say, that belonged to the saint, a little square bell of iron, such as those early Celtic holy men carried, that was kept and venerated on these shores for 1,000 years and more. And there is a carved stone cross on the green isle, weathered by the centuries of Atlantic rain. These are the relics of a Christianity far older and stranger and gentler than anything the rest of Britain remembers. The faith of the Celtic saints who came in their frail boats to these wild coasts, when the rest of Europe had half forgotten the light, and who made of islands like this green isle in Loch Shiel little points of prayer and learning in the surrounding dark. The Highlands are full of such places, half forgotten now, their chapels in ruins, their saints remembered only in the names of the lochs and the glens, but the holiness lingers about them still, a deep old quietness, older than the clans and older than the kings, that you can feel in a place like Glenfinnan if you still your mind and listen for it. And so this one quiet glen that our train crosses in a minute or two on its way to the coast holds layer upon layer of the deep Highland past, each beneath the other like the rings within a tree. There is the new bright railway we ride upon, 4 years old. But beneath it, the memory of the clearances, the empty glens, the vanished people of the last century. Beneath that, the Jacobite story, the Prince and the Standard and the doomed and glorious rising, 160 years gone. And beneath all of it, oldest and deepest of all, the green Isle of St. Finan and his 10 centuries of prayer and burial, reaching back to the very roots of the faith in these islands. It is all here, in this one glen, layered in the silence, and our train, carrying us on toward the sea, runs lightly over the top of all of it, the latest and the least of the long history of Glenfinnan. Now the viaduct is behind us, and the loch is falling away to our left, and the line plunges on into the hills toward the coast. To understand why those Highlanders gathered to the Prince at Glenfinnan, why ordinary men would leave their homes and risk their lives, and in the end lose everything for the sake of a young stranger newly come from over the sea, you must understand a little of the old world they lived in, the world of the clans, a way of life quite unlike anything in the rest of Britain, and it was that very order of things in the end that the rising would destroy. A clan was a great family, or rather a great web of families, all bearing the same name and claiming descent, true or imagined, from a single common ancestor, and all owing their loyalty to the chief, who was the father and the head, and the embodiment of the whole kindred. The chief was no mere landlord. He was the heart of the clan, its leader in war and its judge in peace, bound to his people by ties of blood and tradition and mutual obligation far deeper than any mere matter of rent or law. The humblest clansman held himself the kinsman of his chief, and was proud of it, and the chief, in his turn, was held to owe his people protection, justice, and care, to be the keeper of their welfare as they were the strength of his name. It was a way of life rooted in the land and in loyalty, hard and often violent, for the clans feuded and raided and fought among themselves down the centuries in a ceaseless rough struggle for cattle and territory and honour. But it had its own fierce virtues, its own deep poetry, its own intense human warmth. The clansman's loyalty to his chief and his kindred was the very centre of his being, a thing he would die for without a second thought. The bonds of blood and fellowship were everything, and there was a wild freedom and dignity in that old life, for all its poverty and its danger, that those who lived it would not have traded for all the soft comforts of the South. The music and the poetry and the storytelling of the Gael The songs we have spoken of, the whole rich inheritance of that culture, grew out of this world of the clans, this intense and ancient society of kindred, bound to chief and chief to kindred, and all of them bound to the mountains and the glens that bore them. When the clansmen came down to Glenfinnan with their pipes playing, they were not a modern army of paid soldiers. They were the fighting kindreds of the Highlands, come out at the call of loyalty, for their chiefs and for the rightful king, and for the old order of the world. And that in the end is why the cost of the rising fell so heavy and so lasting upon this country, for in crushing the rebellion, the government set out, quite deliberately, to destroy not just an army but a whole way of life, the entire ancient order of the clans that had made the rising possible, and that it rightly saw as a standing danger so long as it endured. What had bound chief to clansman, that web of kinship and mutual duty older than any law, was deliberately cut. The chief was remade into a mere proprietor of acres, and the clansman into a tenant who might be turned off the ground at a stroke. And the slow result, across the bitter generations that followed, was that the chiefs, no longer fathers of their people, but only owners of their land, came in time to see those people, as the prince's enemies had seen them, as an inconvenience, an obstacle, a thing to be cleared away for sheep. The warm old world of blood and loyalty died, and the cold new age of rent and profit took its place. And the empty glens we have travelled through all day are the final, silent monument to that long dying. The clansmen who raised the standard in the glen could not have dreamed that they were lighting the fire that would, in the end, consume their whole way of life. But so it proved, and the lone Highlander on the tower stands for all of them, the last of the old free kindreds of the mountains, gazing forever down the loch at a world that is gone. Ah, the tower itself, the one with the lonely Highlander on its top, is not so very old. It was raised in the year 1815, some 70 years after the events it marks, by a Highland gentleman whose own family had been out in the Great Rising, as a monument to the men who had gathered at that spot and to the cause they had served and lost. The kilted figure on the summit is not any particular man, but stands for all of them, for the Highland clansmen who came to Glenfinnan that day, and he was set there to gaze forever down the loch up which they came, keeping a watch that will never end over the place where it all began. To understand why a quiet Highland glen should be marked with such a monument, and why that story still has the power to bring a catch to the throat of anyone who knows it, we must go back, past the building of our railway, past the emptying of the glens, to a summer more than 150 years before our journey, and to the young man who came up that water in a boat. His name was Charles Edward Stuart, and he was a prince of a fallen royal house. His grandfather had once been the King of Great Britain, James II, the last Stuart king, but James had been driven from his throne and out of his 3 kingdoms, partly for his religion and partly for his manner of ruling, and the crown had passed to other hands, and the Stuart family had lived ever since in exile, mostly in Rome, dreaming and plotting, and never quite giving up their claim. Charles, the grandson, was born and raised in that exile, in the faded grandeur of an exiled court, nourished from his cradle on a single overwhelming idea, that the throne of Britain was his family's by right, stolen from them, and that it was his destiny to win it back. He grew into a tall, handsome, charming, headstrong young man, brave to the point of recklessness, with an extraordinary gift for inspiring devotion in others and an absolute, unshakable belief in his own royal star. And he fixed his whole heart on one wild ambition, to cross the sea to Scotland, where the loyalty to his exiled house ran deepest, and to raise the Highland clans, and to march on London and take back the crown of his fathers. It was a mad scheme, and everyone sober told him so. He would not be told. In the summer of the year 1745, against the advice of nearly everyone, With almost no money and almost no men, and only the vaguest promises of support, the young prince simply went. He sailed from France in a small ship, with a single companion vessel carrying what few arms and men he had been able to scrape together. And when that companion ship was crippled in a sea fight with a British warship and forced to turn back, Charles, with breathtaking nerve, sailed on alone. He landed first on a small island in the Outer Hebrides, out on the very edge of the Atlantic, and the first Scottish chiefs who came to meet him were dismayed to find that he had come almost empty-handed, and they begged him to go home again while he still could. "Go home," said one of them. "I am come home," the prince is said to have answered. He would not turn back. He crossed to the mainland and anchored in a quiet sea lock among these very western mountains, not many miles from where our train is running now, and there he sent out his letters and his messengers to the clan chiefs of the Highlands, summoning them to come to him, to rise for their rightful king, to meet him in arms at a gathering place he had chosen at the head of a long loch, in a glen called Glenfinnan, and then he waited to see whether anyone at all would come. And so we come to the day itself, the 19th of August in the year 1745, the day that gives this glen its place in history, the day that the lonely stone Highlander stands forever watching for. Picture the scene, here in this very place we are crossing now, but empty of any railway, empty of any bridge, just the wild green glen, and the long loch, and the silent mountains as they had been since the dawn of time. In the early afternoon, a small rowing boat comes up the loch from the south, and grounds on the shore at the head of the water, and the young prince steps out onto the heather, dressed for the part in Highland clothes, his heart high with expectation. For this is the appointed hour, and he has come to meet his army, and he looks about him at the empty glen, and his heart turns to lead. For there is no army, there is almost no one at all. A bare handful of men have come, a few score of MacDonalds, loyal but pitifully few, and otherwise the great glen lies as silent and as still as it does for us today. The clans have not come. After all the dreaming, after all the daring, the prince stands in a deserted glen with 200 men, and it seems that the whole wild venture has failed before it has even begun. For 2 hours he waits, in an agony of suspense, in a rough turf hut by the shore, while the afternoon wears on and still no one comes, and the bitter possibility settles over the little company that they are alone, that the Highlands have not risen, that the great cause is already lost. And then at last, faint and far off, carried down the glen on the afternoon air, comes a sound. It is the sound of bagpipes. Heads lift, hearts leap, every eye turns toward the hills, and over the shoulder of the mountain, winding down into the glen with their pipes playing and their plaids swinging, comes a long column of armed Highlanders, hundreds upon hundreds of them, the men of Clan Cameron marching to join their prince. The great chief Cameron of Lochiel has thrown in his lot with Charles at the last, against his own better judgment, swayed by the young man's desperate charm, and where Lochiel and his Camerons lead, others will follow. The pipes skirl down the glen, the Camerons come on, and behind them, through the rest of that long afternoon and into the evening, come more and more MacDonalds of this branch and that, men of other names and other glens, until the deserted valley is filled with the gathering clans, and the venture that seemed dead an hour ago is gloriously, impossibly alive. And so, in the gold of that summer evening, with perhaps 1,200 armed Highlanders now gathered about him in the glen, the prince raises his standard. An old and venerable nobleman, too frail almost to hold it, unfurls the great banner of red and white silk, sewn for the occasion by loyal hands, and lifts it up into the Highland air, and the prince proclaims his exiled father the rightful king of Scotland, England, and Ireland, and himself his father's regent come to win the kingdoms back. The clansmen roar their loyalty, the pipes play, bonnets are thrown in the air, and casks of brandy are broached and passed among the men, to drink to the king over the water, and to the rising now begun. It is the high, shining, hopeful beginning of the whole adventure, the moment before anything has gone wrong, when everything still seems possible, and the throne of Britain seems almost within the young prince's grasp. They say that Charles was never in his life more cheerful, never more buoyant, than on that evening in the glen, surrounded by his loyal Highlanders with the standard flying above them. He could not see what was coming. None of them could. And perhaps it is as well that on that one golden evening, in this very place, they could believe with their whole hearts that they were going to win. For a few astonishing months, it seemed that he might. From that gathering in the glen, the rising swept out across Scotland like a fire in dry heather, and for a while everything the young prince touched turned to gold. The clans came in, the little Highland army grew, and it marched south and east out of the mountains, down upon the lowlands, down upon the very capital. The city of Edinburgh opened its gates, and the prince held court in the ancient palace of his Stuart ancestors, and for a giddy few weeks the old royal house was restored, in Scotland at least, and the Jacobite court danced and celebrated in the candlelit halls while the pipes played in the streets. A government army sent to crush the rising was met outside the city and broken in a single wild Highland charge in the grey dawn, scattered in minutes, so that the whole of Scotland fell into the prince's hands. And then, greatly daring, the Highland army crossed the border and marched into England itself, heading south for London, town after town, falling silent and fearful before them. And they came at last as far south as the town of Derby, only a few days' march from the capital, with the government in London packing its bags in a panic, and the throne of Britain seeming to tremble within the young prince's reach. It was the high water mark of the whole adventure, the furthest point of the flood. At Derby the tide turned, for at Derby the prince's hard-headed Highland commanders looked at the cold facts, and the facts were grim. The promised English Jacobites had not risen, the promised French invasion had not come, and two large government armies were closing in upon their small and far-flung force. Against the prince's furious objections, his chiefs insisted on retreat, on turning the army around and marching it all the long weary way back north to the safety of the Highlands. And back they went, in the deepening cold of winter, harried all the way, the great adventure visibly draining away from them with every northward mile. The retreat was orderly, and there were victories still to come on the way home, but the heart had gone out of it, and everyone knew in their bones that the one great chance had been let slip at Derby and would never come again. The army that had set out so full of hope came trailing back into the Highlands in the dead of winter, dwindling, exhausted, pursued, and behind it, gathering its full strength, came the government's vengeance in the person of the king's own son, a hard and capable commander with a large, well-fed, well-drilled army, determined to hunt the rebels down and finish the rising for good. The end came on a bleak moor near Inverness, called Culloden, on a freezing day in April of the year 1746. There the prince, against all the advice of his best men, chose to stand and fight a pitched battle on open level ground, the worst possible ground for his half-starved, exhausted Highlanders, the best possible ground for the enemy's guns and disciplined ranks. It was over in less than an hour. The Highland charge, that terrible weapon that had won at Edinburgh, broke this time on the wall of government muskets and cannon and bayonets, and the clans were shattered, and the prince's cause died there on the moor in the sleet, along with a great many of the brave men who had followed it. I will not linger over the killing, for it was a cruel day and a crueler aftermath, and you do not need the details of it to feel the weight of what was lost. It is enough to say that the rising that had begun in such glory in our quiet glen ended in blood and ruin on Culloden Moor, that the old Highland world received there a wound from which it would never recover, and that the dream of the Stuarts was finished forever. The prince himself escaped the field, but he was now a hunted fugitive in his own lost cause, with a great price on his head, and nothing before him but flight. What followed is the part of the story that the Highlands have never forgotten and never will, and it is the part that turned a failed rebellion into an undying legend. For 5 months, through the summer and into the autumn after Culloden, the hunted prince wandered through these very mountains and islands of the west, a fugitive with the greatest manhunt in the history of Scotland at his heels. The government put an enormous price upon his head, a fortune beyond the wildest dreams of any poor Highlander, enough to make a crofting family rich for 10 generations, and not one person betrayed him. Hundreds of ordinary Highland people, the poorest people in Britain, sheltered him and fed him and guided him and hid him and lied for him, passing him from hand to hand across the wild country, ferrying him from island to island under the very noses of the patrolling soldiers and the cruising warships. And never once, though many of them knew exactly where he was, did a single one of them take the money. It is one of the most extraordinary acts of collective loyalty in all of history. The most famous of those who saved him was a young woman named Flora MacDonald, who smuggled the prince through the searching soldiers disguised as her Irish maidservant, and carried him by boat across the water to the Isle of Skye, a deed remembered ever after in one of the most beloved of all the songs of Scotland, the lament of the boat that carried the lad who was born to be king over the sea to Skye, and in the end he got away. After all those months of hardship and hunger and hiding in caves and on the open hill, a French ship came at last to take the broken prince off to safety and exile, and the place where it came for him, the spot from which bonny Prince Charlie left Scotland forever, was a quiet sea loch on this very coast, only a few miles ahead of our train, a loch the railway runs right along the edge of. And here is the detail that gives the whole story its terrible, perfect shape, the thing that catches at me every time I think of it, that the very same shore from which he sailed away into exile and final defeat was the very strand where, a year before, full of hope, he had first landed to begin the whole adventure. He left from almost exactly the spot where he had come. The circle closed. He sailed away across the sea, and he never set foot in Scotland again, never saw the Highlands or the loyal clans again, and lived out the remainder of his life abroad, a sad and declining figure, the bright golden prince of the glen slowly fading into a disappointed old man, dying at last in Rome, far from the mountains, more than 40 years later, with the dream long dead. But the people he left behind never forgot him. They could not. He had cost them everything, for the price of the rising was paid, in the end, not by the prince, who escaped, but by the Highlands themselves, and it was a fearful price. The government was determined that there should never be another rising, and it set about destroying, deliberately and systematically, the whole ancient way of life that had made the rising possible. The clan system, that old web of loyalty and kinship that bound chief and people together, was broken by law. The carrying of weapons was forbidden, the playing of the pipes, even the wearing of the tartan and the kilt, the very dress of the Highlander, was outlawed for a generation, on pain of imprisonment and worse. The power of the chiefs was stripped away, and with it their old sense of obligation to their people. And it was this, in the bitter years that followed, that opened the way to the clearances, to the chiefs turning their backs on the clansmen who had once been their children and their soldiers, and putting them off the land for sheep. Do you see how it all joins up? The flag raised in the glen, the glory and the ruin, Culloden, the breaking of the clans, and then the long, slow emptying of the country, the burned roofs and the emigrant ships and the silent glens we have been travelling through all morning. It is all one story. The lonely Highlander on his tower, gazing down the loch, is gazing across the whole of it, across the bright hope of the gathering and the long sorrow of everything that came after. That is why he stands there. That is what he is watching for. And that is the ground our little train has been carrying us across, all this while, through all this beauty. Now the line begins its long descent toward the coast, and the country through which it runs takes on, for those who know the story, an almost unbearable poignancy, for we are entering the very heart of the prince's country, the ground over which the whole Jacobite drama played out its first and last acts. Somewhere down here, in a quiet sea lock that the railway runs along the very edge of, is the shore where Charles Edward Stuart first set foot on the Scottish mainland in the summer of 1745, full of hope to begin his great adventure. And it is the same shore, as I have told you, from which he sailed away into exile and oblivion a little more than a year later, broken and hunted, with his cause in ruins behind him. The water our train now runs beside is the water that carried him both times, coming and going, hope and despair, the beginning and the end. There is a cairn of stones on that shore now, raised in later years to mark the spot where he left Scotland for the last time, gazing out over the sea toward the islands and the open Atlantic beyond which he sailed and never returned. We pass within a stone's throw of it, and all through these last miles before the sea, the land is thick with the memory of those desperate months when the prince was a fugitive in this very glen country, hunted through these hills. Up some of these glens that open off our line in caves and shielings and the houses of the poor, he hid and starved and waited, moving by night, sleeping by day, always a step ahead of the soldiers who quartered the whole district searching for him. The folk of this coast, the ancestors of the crofters riding in our carriage and standing on the lonely platforms, were the people who sheltered him, who fed him from their own scant stores, who rode him from island to island in the dark, who kept his secret, though a king's ransom was offered for it. This is loyal ground, Jacobite to the very bone, its folk having paid a terrible price for their devotion to a lost cause and a vanished prince, and never, in all the bitter years that followed, regretted it or betrayed it. The very rocks remember him. And our bright modern railway, with its concrete and its steam and its tourists, runs lightly over ground soaked in that old and stubborn loyalty. The line crosses here some of the boldest of all McAlpine's concrete works, for the country between the mountains and the sea is broken and difficult, gashed by sea locks and rocky gorges, and the railway has to leap them. There is one bridge along here, a single soaring arch of concrete flung across a deep wooded gorge. That was, when McAlpine built it, the longest concrete span of its kind anywhere in the world, a record-breaking marvel that engineers came from far away to study, and that we cross now in a few seconds without a second thought. There are tunnels bored through headlands of solid rock, the train plunging suddenly into roaring darkness and as suddenly bursting out again into the light, with the sea now glittering below. The line twists and turns and climbs and dips, hugging the contours of this impossible coast, threading between the mountains and the water, every yard of it a small triumph of the builder's art, and the views it opens, as it swings round each new headland, grow wilder and lovelier and more touched with the sea at every turn. And then, quite suddenly, between two shoulders of rock you see it, the sea itself, the open western sea, no longer a sea lock reaching inland, but the true Atlantic, vast and silver and shining, stretching away to a horizon scattered with the blue shapes of islands. After the long morning among the landlocked mountains, the sight of that open sea comes as a kind of release, a great opening out of the heart, and there is hardly a soul in the carriage who does not lean to the window at the first glimpse of it. The light is different here, brighter, cleaner, full of the dazzle of water. The air that comes in at the window is keen with salt and weed and the freshness of the wide ocean. We have crossed the whole width of the wild country, from the foot of the highest mountain in Britain to the edge of the Atlantic, and here at last is the sea and the islands and the end of the land. The train runs on now along the very shore, with the waves almost beneath us, toward the little stations of the coast and the harbour at the end of the line. The first of the coastal stations we come to, as the line runs out at last beside the salt water, is a little place called Ariseg, and it holds a small distinction that delights the travellers who learn of it. This modest Highland halt, at the edge of the Western Sea, is the most westerly railway station on the whole mainland of Britain. There is no station further west than this in all the island. Beyond here the land runs out, and the rails can go no further west, only north along the coast to their ending at the harbour. There is something that stirs the imagination in that simple fact, in having come, by this long journey through the mountains, to the very western limit of the railways of Britain, to the last station before the open ocean and the Isles. Stand on the platform here, if only in your mind, and feel the wind off the sea, and look out at the water and the islands, and know that you have come about as far west as the iron road will carry you in this country, to the edge of the land, the brink of the Atlantic, the threshold of the Isles. The country here at the coast is utterly changed from the dark mountains we have travelled through, softened and brightened and open to the sea and the sky. The great brooding hills draw back a little from the shore, and between them and the water lies a gentler land of low rocky knolls, and little green fields and white croft houses, of bays and inlets and headlands, all of it washed in the clean bright light that comes off the sea. The shore is a thing of wonder along this coast. In the sheltered bays the sand is white, dazzlingly so, the ground-up shells and quartz of ages, and where the shallow water lies over it the sea turns the most astonishing colours, pale greens and clear turquoise blues, such as you would think belonged to some warm tropical island, and never to the cold coast of Scotland, until a cloud crosses the sun and the magic is gone and the water turns grey again. There are days when the sun is out and the tide is low, when these little Highland bays, with their white sand and their turquoise shallows and the blue islands beyond, are as beautiful as any place on the surface of the earth, and the few travellers fortunate enough to see them, so never forget the sight. And out beyond the pale shores and the turquoise shallows, across a few miles of open water, lie the islands, riding the silver sea, blue and dreamlike in the distance, the first of the Hebrides, the isles to which this whole road has been leading all the day long. They lie strung along the horizon, each with its own distinctive shape, its own character, its own long history. And to a traveller seeing them for the first time, floating out there on the shining water, under the great western sky, they seem the very picture of romance and remoteness, the islands at the edge of the world, half real and half a dream. The people of this coast have looked out at those islands every day of their lives. The boats have plied between the mainland and the isles since the beginning of time, and now our railway has come to the coast precisely in order to meet those boats, to be the swift new link between the islands and the wider world. We are nearly at the sea's edge now, nearly at the end of the line. But before we run on to the harbour, let me tell you a little about those blue islands on the horizon, for each of them is a world unto itself, and they are worth the knowing. The nearest cluster of islands lying off this coast, the ones whose shapes you can make out most clearly from the carriage window as we run along the shore, are known together as the Small Isles, and though they are tiny indeed, a mere handful of folk living on each, they carry between them as much history and as much beauty and as much sorrow as islands 10 times their size. There are 4 of them, and the old people of the coast have a rhyme to tell them by, naming each by its chief quality. There is the great mountainous one, all jagged peaks and wild corries, rising steep and dark from the sea, the grandest and most rugged of the 4. There is the green and fertile one, low and gentle and kindly, long the most populous and prosperous of the group. There is the small flat one, least and lowest of them, and there is the far one, lying out beyond the others toward the open Atlantic. Each is a little kingdom of its own, with its own people and its own ways and its own long story reaching back into the mists, and together they lie there off our shore, four green and blue and purple shapes upon the silver water, impossibly lovely in the afternoon light. But the beauty of the islands, like the beauty of the empty glens, hides its share of sorrow, for the small isles too have known the heavy hand of history. The green and fertile island, in particular, holds a dark and terrible memory from the old wild days of the clan feuds, a tale of almost the entire population of the island, hundreds of souls, men, women and children, taking refuge from a raiding party in a great cave along the shore, and being discovered there, and perishing all together in the most pitiful way, so that the island that looks so green and peaceful from our passing train carries in its memory one of the darkest deeds in all the grim history of the clans. And the islands, like the mainland glens, were cleared in their turn, their people put off the land in the last century to make room for sheep and for deer, and for the sporting pleasure of distant owners, so that islands that once supported hundreds of people now hold only a scattered few. The same long sorrow that emptied the mainland glens reached out across the water to empty the islands too, and the loveliness of the small isles, like the loveliness of all this coast, is a loveliness shadowed with loss. And yet, for all that, the islands endure, and the life of them goes on, harder and smaller than it was but unbroken. There are still folk on each of the four, crofting the thin soil, fishing the surrounding seas, keeping a few beasts, living the ancient island life at the very edge of the world, and the boats still come and go, carrying the people and their goods to and from the mainland, as they have done since the first men came to these shores in their skin boats, thousands of years ago. The islands have their own birds in their countless thousands, their own seals, their own wild flowers carpeting the machair, that strange and lovely grassland of the Western Isles, in a blaze of summer colour. They have their standing stones and their old chapels and their burial grounds, the marks of all the folk who have lived and died on them down the long ages. And on a fine evening, when the sun goes down behind them into the Atlantic, they stand black against a sky of impossible gold and crimson, the most romantic sight in all the West, the very islands of the heart's desire, and many a traveller, seeing them so from this coast, has felt the deep old pull of the isles, the longing to take a boat and sail out to them and never come back. We, though, must keep to the mainland and the railway a little longer, for the end of our line is near at hand. Away to the north, as we run along the coast, there rises out of the sea the greatest of all the islands of this western shore, and the sight of it on a clear day is one that no traveller ever forgets, for it is crowned with mountains unlike any others in Britain. This is the Isle of Skye, the Winged Isle, the largest and most famous of the Inner Hebrides, lying just off this coast across a narrow sound, and along its spine runs the dark and savage range of the Quillen, a wall of bare black jagged peaks, the most fearsome and dramatic mountains in all these islands, rising sheer from the sea in a serrated line, that looks, from this distance, like the ramparts of some giant's fortress, or the teeth of the world. When the cloud lifts from the Quillen, and you see them clear blue-black against the sky across the shining water, there is a wildness and a grandeur in the sight that stops the breath. And when, as more often happens, the cloud lies wreathed about their summits, trailing and shifting, the half-hidden peaks looming through it look stranger and more dreamlike still. Skye is a place of legend and of song, the very heart of the romance of the Highlands, and to see it lift out of the sea from our passing train is to feel that we are truly at the edge of the old wild world of the Gael. It was to Skye, you will remember, that the hunted prince was carried by the brave Flora MacDonald in the worst of his wanderings, smuggled across the water disguised as her serving maid in the most famous episode of all his flight, and the boat that bore him over the sea to that island is remembered in the most beloved of all the songs of the Jacobite cause, a soft and lilting and heartbreaking lament that has been sung wherever Scots have gathered, at home and in exile, from that day to this. It tells in its gentle rocking melody, like the rocking of the very boat upon the waves, of the prince carried over the sea to sky, of the loyal hearts that bore him, of the lost cause and the broken dream and the longing for the king to come again. And there is in it all the tenderness and all the sorrow of the whole Jacobite story distilled into a single sweet, sad air. To look out at sky from this coast, with that melody running in the mind, is to feel the past and the present, the history and the landscape, fold together into one thing, so that the blue island across the water seems to carry in its very shape the memory of the boat and the prince and the loyal girl and the lost and lovely cause. For the islands of the West are, more than anywhere, the country of the heart's longing, the islands that the exiles dreamed of in their banishment and sang of in their songs, the far blue shapes on the horizon toward which all the roads and all the music and all the yearning of this country seem forever to lead. There is an old and powerful enchantment in islands, in any islands, in their separateness, their completeness, their mystery, the way they lie just out of reach across the water, promising something that the mainland can never quite give, and the islands of the Hebrides, set in their silver seas under their great skies, wreathed in their legends and their songs, hold that enchantment more strongly than almost anywhere on earth. Generations of travellers have stood on this coast and looked out at them and felt the deep pull of them, the wish to take ship and sail away west to the Isles and leave the world behind. And our railway, that has brought us to this shore, exists in large part to carry people and goods to the boats that cross to those very islands, to be the link between the mainland and the dream. We are nearly at the harbour now from which those boats set out. But first, one last wonder of the coast lies before us, and it is perhaps the loveliest of all. Just before the harbour at the end of the line, the railway runs past a stretch of coast so beautiful that it seems almost unfair, a place called Morar, where everything that is loveliest about this western shore is gathered together in a single dazzling few miles. Here are the famous white sands of Morar, beaches of sand so pale it is nearly silver, blindingly bright in the sun, ground fine over the ages from white shells and quartz, curving in great sweeps around bays where the sea lies over them, in bands of the most extraordinary colour, jade and turquoise and aquamarine near the shore, deepening to sapphire and indigo further out, colours you would swear belonged to some coral island of the tropics, and could never be found on the cold Atlantic edge of Scotland. On a fine day, the white sands and the coloured sea of Morar, with the blue islands beyond and the great sky above, compose a picture of such loveliness that travellers fall silent before it, hardly able to believe that such a place exists, here at the rainy western rim of the Highlands, and many who have seen it have called it the most beautiful coast in all of Britain, and been hard put to think of its equal anywhere. Behind the pale sands, a very short river runs down to the sea from a loch hidden among the hills, and both the river and the loch hold small wonders worth the telling. The river is one of the shortest in all of Britain, running only a few hundred yards from the loch to the sea, so brief a passage that you might almost throw a stone its whole length, and yet down that short channel pours all the water of the loch behind, in a rush of falls and pools, on its little hurrying journey from fresh water to salt. And the loch itself, Loch Morar, stretching away inland among the mountains, is the deepest body of fresh water in all the British Isles, plunging down in its hidden middle, to depths greater than almost anyone would credit. A great cold black trench of water scoured out by the ice of the last age, so deep that its floor lies far below the level of the sea outside. There are old tales told along its shores, as there are of so many deep dark Highland lochs, of a strange creature that is said to dwell in its depths, and to show itself, now and then, to those about to die. And whether you believe in such things or not, you cannot look at the still black surface of so deep and lonely a loch, with the mountains crowding round it, without feeling that it keeps its secrets, and that there might indeed be anything at all down there in the cold dark depths that no light has ever reached. So here at Morar, the land gives us its last and loveliest gift before the journey's end. The white sands and the jewelled sea, and the islands beyond, the short bright river, and the still dark loch, all of it crowded into a few miles of coast, as if the country were determined to send us off with the very best it had. The train runs slowly along above the white shore, and the whole carriage is at the windows now, gazing out at the impossible colours of the water, and even the old crofting folk who have seen it 1,000 times look out at it with a quiet pride, for it is their coast, and they know what they have. The light is beginning to lengthen and soften toward the long evening as we pass, gilding the white sands, deepening the colours of the sea, and the islands lie dreaming on the water under a sky beginning, ever so slightly, to take on the first gold of the coming sunset. There is only a little way to go now. Just ahead, round one more headland, lies the harbour at the end of the line, the goal of all our journey, the meeting place of the railway and the sea. Let us run on into it as the day begins its long, slow decline toward the west. The whole reason for this railway, the practical hard-headed reason that loosened the purse strings and set Concrete Bob's navvies digging, was the fish, and above all, one fish, the herring, the silver darling of the Scottish seas. And as we come down at last toward the harbour, it is time to understand the great trade that our line was built to serve. The herring is a small, plain, oily fish, nothing much to look at, but it came in those days in numbers beyond all imagining, vast shoals of it moving through the western seas, so dense that the water itself seemed to boil with them, enough to feed nations. And the catching and curing and selling of the herring was one of the great industries of Scotland, employing tens of thousands of people up and down the coast, and putting food on tables across half of Europe. Out from the little harbours of this coast the fishing fleets put to sea, scores and hundreds of boats, sailing out in the evening to shoot their long drift nets across the path of the shoals, and lie to them all the dark night through, hauling them back in the cold of the dawn, heavy and silver, and shining with the catch, and racing back to harbour to land the fish while it was fresh. It was at the harbour that the other half of the great work was done, and it was done very largely by women, the famous fisher lassies, the herring girls, who followed the fleets round the coast from port to port through the season, and who could gut and pack the herring with a speed that had to be seen to be believed. As the boats landed their catch, the fish were tipped out in glittering heaps, and the girls fell upon them 3 to a team, their fingers flying, the gutting knife flashing, each girl cleaning a fish with 2 or 3 swift strokes, and tossing it sorted by size into the waiting tubs, hour after hour, in all weathers, their hands wrapped in rag against the salt and the knife, working so fast the eye could scarcely follow, singing as they worked the old songs to keep the rhythm. The gutted fish were packed in barrels between layers of salt, pressed down and headed up and sent away to be sold. And a good harbour in the height of the season was a scene of tremendous bustle and energy and noise. The boats coming and going, the fish pouring ashore, the girls at their gutting, the coopers hammering at the barrels, the buyers shouting their bids, the whole place reeking gloriously of fish and salt and tar and the sea. And here is where our railway comes in, and where it changed everything for this coast. Before the line, the herring landed at a remote western harbour like the one we are coming to had to be sent to the great markets of the south by sea, a slow business, the fish often spoiling before it could be sold, much of its value lost. Or it had to be salted and barrelled for the slower trade, never reaching the tables of the cities fresh. But now, with the railway run right down to the harbour, everything was transformed. The herring landed in the dawn could be packed straight into railway wagons with ice, and the fish train could go thundering away up the line and through the night to Glasgow and the south, so that fish swimming in the Western Sea one evening might be sold fresh in a city market a day later, hundreds of miles away. It was a kind of miracle, the speed of it, and it made the fortune of the harbour at the end of our line, turning a tiny remote fishing station into one of the great herring ports of all Scotland, simply because the railway came there. The whole place was made by the line, and the line, in turn, was paid for by the fish. The two were bound together, the iron road and the silver harvest of the sea, and it is that union we are riding down to witness at the journey's end. There is one thing about the people of this coast that a traveller from the south becomes aware of almost at once, and it sets this country apart from nearly all the rest of Britain, and it is this, that the language you hear spoken softly around you, by the old crofting woman with her basket, by the shepherd, by the fisherman on the harbour, is very often not English at all, but the ancient Gaelic tongue of the Highlands, the language that was spoken in these glens long before English was ever heard in them, and that lingers here at the western edge when it has died away almost everywhere else. It is a soft and musical and very old language, full of sounds that the southern ear finds strange and beautiful, and it carries within it the whole soul of the old Highland world, its way of seeing the land and the sea and the seasons, its deep attachment to place and kin. Every loch and hill and headland in all this country has its true name in the Gaelic, a name often centuries or thousands of years old, that describes it, or remembers some event upon it, or names some forgotten person who lived there, so that the whole landscape, to those who have the language, is written over with meaning and memory like a vast book, where to us who have it not, it is only so much beautiful blank scenery. The Gaelic world was above all a world of song and story, for these were not a people who wrote their hearts in books, but one who carried their whole inheritance in their memory and their voice, in the songs and tales and poems handed down by the fireside from one generation to the next across uncounted years. There were songs for everything in the old life, for the rowing of the boats, sung to keep the time of the oars, for the milking and the spinning and the grinding of the corn, airs of love and laments of grief, and great heroic lays of the old warriors and the old battles, dirges for the chiefs and the clansmen who fell in the risings, and aching tunes of exile sung by those who had been cleared away over the sea, full of longing for the lost glens of home. The music of this people is some of the most beautiful and most moving in all the world, and it is the true voice of this country, far more than any words of mine. And if you could hear, drifting from some croft house as we pass, an old woman singing one of those songs in the Gaelic to herself as she works, in that high, lonely, keening style of the islands, you would understand this land and its long sorrow better in a moment than in a whole day of my telling. But the old tongue is dying, even now, even in 1905, and the very railway we ride upon is one of the things that is killing it. For the railway brings in the English language and the English world that the newspapers and the visitors and the wider commerce of the age, and the young people, learning that English is the language of getting on, of work and money and all that lay beyond the glens, drift away from the Gaelic of their parents toward the speech of the South. It is the old story once again, the new sweeping away the old, and there is loss in it as well as gain, as there always is. A language is not just a set of words, it is a whole way of seeing existence, 1,000 years of a people's experience and feeling and wisdom distilled into speech, and when it dies, that whole realm dies with it and cannot be recovered. The Gaelic of the Highlands is one of the great old languages of Europe, and it is fading here on these western shores, like the light fading from the hills in the evening, and 100 years on, in our own day, it clings on in only a few last strongholds, beautiful and frail. Listen for it as we pass in the soft voices of the people. You are hearing something very old and very lovely and very nearly gone. And so this coast, that seems at first sight so empty and so wild, is in truth as full of human meaning as any place on earth, layered over with names and songs and memories in a language most of its passers-by will never understand, the long inheritance of a people who have loved this hard and beautiful country with their whole hearts for 1,000 years and more, through every sorrow that history has sent them. The mountains and the lochs and the islands are not just scenery, but they are the homeland of a people, and the book of their story, written in a tongue older than the kingdoms. It is well to remember that, as we ride through on our comfortable train exclaiming at the views, that this is somebody's country, deeply and anciently somebody's country, and that the soft Gaelic speech we half hear around us is the voice of the land itself. Speaking still now, though, the train is slowing again, and the harbour cannot be far ahead, and the smell of the sea and of fish and of tar is growing strong on the air. We are coming to the end of the line. The folk who remain on this coast, the ones who were not cleared away or who crept back to the shore after the clearing, live for the most part by a way of life called crofting, and it is worth understanding a little of it, for it is the living human reality behind all the picturesque white cottages we pass, and it is a harder life than its prettiness suggests. A croft is a small holding of land, very small, a few acres of ground that a family works to grow what food it can, a patch of oats and potatoes, a little hay that could keep for a cow or two, and a few sheep and some hens, together with a share in the rough common grazing of the hill behind, where the beasts are put out in the summer. It is not enough to live on, a croft, not nearly enough. The ground is too poor and too small, and the weather too harsh, for any family to win a full living from it, and so the crofter must always have some other source of income besides. The fishing, above all, on this coast, and the men going out after the herring and the white fish in their open boats, or seasonal work away from home, or the selling of a beast, or the weaving of cloth, or, increasingly now, the money brought in by the visitors. The crofting life is one of piecing together, of getting by, of unremitting labour for a bare sufficiency, lived always on the edge of hardship, and yet there is a great dignity in it, and a great toughness, and for all its hardship the folk who live it are deeply, stubbornly attached to it, for it is theirs, it is independence of a kind, it is a life lived on their own land, in their own glen among their own kin, and that is worth more than money to those who have it. The crofting townships strung along this coast, little clusters of low houses with their patchwork of narrow fields running down to the shore, are the last remnant of the old Highland world, the one that the clearances so nearly destroyed. The people in them are the descendants of those who held on, who were not driven out, or who fought their way back, and who keep alive, against every economic pressure, the old connection between these folk and this land. They have had to fight for even that much, for the right simply to hold their small crofts in security, not to be cast out at a landlord's whim as their grandparents were. The crofters of the Highlands had to struggle hard and long, and the struggle was but lately won when our train ran. Theirs is a story of endurance, of holding on by the fingernails to a hard life in a hard place, because the alternative was to lose everything that made them what they were. The houses themselves that look so charming from the train, the long, low whitewashed cottages with their thick walls and their narrow windows, were built that way for the hardest of practical reasons, to stand against the ferocious Atlantic gales that come screaming in off the sea in the winter storms, winds that would tear the roof off any taller or flimsier building. The old houses, the very old ones, had no chimney even, only a hole in the thatch for the peat smoke to find its way out, so that the family lived in a perpetual gentle fugue of smoke that blackened the rafters, and they believed kept them healthy. The fire that burned in them, and burns in many still, was not of coal, which had to be brought from far away at great cost, but of peat, the dried turf of the bog, cut by hand in the spring in the back-breaking labour of the peat banks, stacked to dry through the summer and burned through the winter with its own particular sweet brown reek that is one of the abiding smells of the Highlands and the Islands, a smell that any exile from this country, smelling it again after long years, will know in an instant and be undone by. That peat smoke drifting blue from the cottage chimneys along the shore is the very breath of the old Highland life, still flickering on here at the western edge. It is a life that is passing, this crofting life, even as the Gaelic is passing, worn away by the same slow pressures of the modern age. Many a croft house we pass stands empty now, or holds only an old couple whose children have gone away to the cities or the colonies and will not come back to the hard round of the croft. But it is not gone yet, not in 1905, and not even in our own much later day, when against all the odds the crofting communities of the West still cling to their shores, still work their small fields, still keep their beasts on the hill, still speak, some of them, the old tongue, the last living thread connecting the Highlands of today to the whole long history we have been travelling through. There is something heroic in that holding on, that refusal to let the old ways die altogether, and as we pass the last crofts before the harbour, the smoke rising blue from their chimneys, a child waving from a doorway, a woman pausing in her work to watch the train, let us salute the people of this coast, who have kept faith with their hard and lovely country through everything that has been done to it, and who are there still. No account of the old ways of this country would be complete without a word about the drink that warms it, the whisky, the water of life as the Gaelic name has it, for it runs through the whole story of the Highlands like a golden thread, woven into every gathering and welcome, every hardship and joy. In a cold, wet country, at the hard edge of the world, where the winters are long and dark, and the labour bitter and the comforts few, a dram of good whisky by the fire was no small thing. It was warmth and cheer and fellowship, the spirit that loosened the tongue for the song and the story, that sealed the bargain and welcomed the stranger, and eased the grief at the wake, and lifted the heart at the wedding. The brandy that the prince broached for his clansmen in the glen was a foreign luxury. The true drink of the country was its own whisky, distilled from the barley of the little fields in pot stills that had stood in the glens for generations, by men who had learned the craft from their fathers as their fathers had from theirs, a craft as old and as native to this country as the language itself. And for a long age, much of that distilling was done in secret, against the law, in defiance of the taxes that a distant government laid upon the spirit. For the Highlander saw no justice in being forbidden to make, from his own barley, on his own ground, the drink his people had always made, and saw no shame whatever in cheating the excise of its due. All through these glens, in hidden places by the burns, in caves and bothies and lonely shielings far up the hills, the illicit stills bubbled away, the blue smoke of them carefully made to drift unseen, the casks hidden in the heather or sunk in the peat, the whole community bound together in a cheerful conspiracy against the tacksman and his hated officers, who ventured into the glens to hunt the stills at considerable risk to themselves. There was a whole romance to it, the smuggling and the hiding and the outwitting of the law, and the whisky of those secret Highland stills, made with care and patience by men who knew exactly what they were doing, was famous as the finest in all the land, far better than the legal stuff, carrying in it, men said, the very taste of the peat and the heather and the clear cold water of the hills it was made from. It is a gentler trade now. In our own day, much of it brought within the law and carried on in proper licensed distilleries, though the old illicit spirit still flows quietly in places, and the love of a good dram is undimmed in this country, and never will be dimmed. But the meaning of it is unchanged, that here at the hard edge of the world, in the cold and the wet and the dark, men found a way to distill from their own poor barley a golden warmth to comfort them, a drink to share by the fire that made the long nights shorter and the hard life sweeter and the bonds of friendship warmer, and that whenever the people of this country gather, to this day, to mark a joy or a sorrow, or simply the pleasure of one another's company, the whisky is there, the water of life, doing its old kind work of warming and cheering and binding together. Think of it now, that golden warmth by the glowing peat, the dram passed from hand to hand in the fire-lit room, the song rising, the cold and the dark shut out, the company close and warm, and let the thought of that warmth go with you as we run on through these last miles, the fire-lit room and the friendly faces and the old songs rising, the welcome and the company against the dark, for the train is gathering itself now toward the end of its road, and the harbour at the edge of the sea is almost in sight. And now at last the train rounds the final headland, and there below us, cupped in a rocky bay at the very end of the line, lies Mallaig, the harbour that has been the goal of all our journey, the meeting place of the railway and the western sea. It is not a grand place, nor an old one. A few years ago, before the line came, it was the merest scatter of cottages on a remote shore, a handful of fishing families and little else. But the railway made it, almost overnight, and now it is a bustling, thriving, crowded little port, raw and new and full of energy, packed into its small rocky compass between the hills and the harbour water. The line runs right down onto the pier, so that the trains and the boats meet almost side by side, and the whole place is given over, heart and soul, to the business of the sea and the fish. The harbour is crowded with the masts of the fishing fleet, scores of sturdy boats rafted together at the quays or lying out at their moorings with more standing in and out across the bay. The pier is a chaos of purposeful activity, fish being landed in glittering heaps, the herring girls at their gutting barrels and boxes and nets and ropes everywhere, carts and barrows, the fish wagons waiting on the line, men shouting, gulls screaming overhead in their thousands, the whole scene wrapped in the powerful reek of fish and salt and tar and coal smoke. After the long silence of the empty glens, the bustle and the din and the human energy of the harbour come as a cheerful shock, a sudden plunge back into the world of men and work and noise. This is a place that lives, and lives hard by the sea, a place of fishermen and fish curers and boatmen and railwaymen, of weather and tides and the endless gamble of the catch, of money made and lost on the silver harvest of the deep. There is nothing genteel about it, nothing made for the tourist. It is a working port, rough and ready and entirely real, and there is a great vitality in it, a sense of a port fully alive and fully occupied with the serious business of wresting a living from the sea. And it is all, every bit of it, the child of our railway, for without the line there would be no port here at all, only the old scatter of cottages, and the herring would still be swimming uncaught in the western sea, for want of any way to send it to market. The line made Mallaig, and Mallaig justifies the line, and to stand on the pier here, with the trains at your back and the boats before you and the fish pouring ashore between them, is to see the whole purpose of this remarkable railway fulfilled before your eyes. But Mallaig is more than a fish pier. It is also a gateway, a threshold, the jumping-off place for the islands and the wild lands beyond. And from this little harbour, the boats set out across the water to all the romantic destinations of the West. From here the ferry crosses to Skye, that great island we have watched all afternoon lifting its black mountains from the sea. From here the boats go out to the small isles, calling at each of those 4 little kingdoms in turn with their passengers and their mails and their supplies. And from here, too, you may take a boat into one of the wildest and most remote corners of the whole British mainland, a roadless wilderness of mountain and sea loch lying just across the water that can be reached even now by no road at all, only by boat or on foot over the high passes. Mallaig is the door to all of this, the place where the iron certainties of the railway give way to the older, slower, more uncertain travel of the sea, where the timetable ends and the tides take over. Behind us lies the whole length of Britain, knit together by its railways. Ahead lies the sea, and the islands and the trackless west, reached as they have always been reached, by boat, at the mercy of wind and weather. We have come to the very edge, the point where the land and the railway alike run out, and the sea begins. We have spoken much of the fish that the railway carried away to the south, for that was its great purpose and its making. But a railway runs in 2 directions, and it is worth thinking, too, of all that the line carried the other way, inward and westward, into the country. For in its quiet way that inward traffic changed the life of this coast as much as the outward did. Down the line from the south now came all manner of things that had been hard or impossible to get before: coal for the fires, in place of the laboriously cut peat, flour and tea and sugar, and all the goods of the shops, tools and timber and iron, furniture and cloth, and the small luxuries that brighten a life, the newspapers bringing word of the outside only a day old, where before the news had come weeks late or not at all, and the letters, the precious letters, carried now swiftly and surely by the mails, binding the scattered families of this emigrant country together across the miles and the oceans as never before. The croft at the end of the line was no longer quite the isolated, self-sufficient, cut-off thing it had been. It was joined now, by the slender thread of the railway, to the whole teeming commerce and life of the nation, and 100 things that had once been beyond reach were brought, by the daily train, to its very door. And down the line too came people, and not only the tourists and the sportsmen, came the sons and daughters of the coast who had gone away to work in the cities, returning now for a visit, a wedding, a funeral, a summer at home, where before going away had so often meant going for good. Came the officials and the merchants and the men of affairs whose business now reached into this once remote country. Came in time the doctor more easily, the help in trouble, the link to the hospital in the town. The railway wove this coast into the body of the nation for good and ill, and much of what it brought was simple good, the easing of a hard life, the ending of an isolation that had been as much a burden as a protection. The old self-contained world was breaking up, yes, but the new connection brought real blessings with it, real lightening of the load that the people of this coast had borne so long alone, and it would be sentimental and false to mourn the lost isolation without remembering the genuine hardship that isolation had always meant. So the line ran both ways, as lines do, carrying the silver fish out to the markets of the world, and carrying the wares and the news and the people of the world back into the waiting coast. And the harbour at its end was the place where the 2 streams met and crossed, the fish going out, the trade coming in, the whole busy 2-way traffic of a country joined at last to its nation. It is a homely thought, perhaps, after all the grandeur and the sorrow of the day, this thought of coal and flour and letters coming down the line to the crofts of the West. But it is a true one, and a kindly one, and it belongs to the real meaning of the railway, as much as the fish train and the viaduct do. The line was, in the end, a thread of connection, a binding together, a reaching out of hand to hand across the wild country, and there is something good in that, something worth carrying into the dark, the image of all those small homely blessings flowing quietly down the iron road into the lonely places, easing, joining, lightening, day after day, year after year, the patient kindly work of the line. Down at the pier, where the railway ends and the sea begins, there is a constant coming and going of boats of every kind, for this little harbour is the hinge between two whole ages of travel, the world of the iron rails behind us, and the older realm of the salt water ahead, and to watch the traffic of it is to understand the place. There are the steamers, the little coasting vessels that ply up and down this western seaboard and out among the islands, carrying passengers and mails and goods, calling at Mallaig now that the railway has made it the gateway to the Isles, taking aboard the travellers the train has brought, and bearing them away across the water to Skye, to the small isles, to the remote settlements of the roadless lands. There are the ferries, smaller and humbler, that make the shorter crossings, the fishing boats, of course, in their scores, the working heart of the harbour, and all manner of lesser craft, the rowing boats and the sailing skiffs by which the people of the coast and the islands have got about upon the water since time out of mind. The whole bright restless surface of the harbour is alive with them, coming and going, loading and unloading, their sails and their funnels and their masts, a moving forest against the shining sea. To step from the train onto the deck of one of those island steamers, as many a traveller does here, is to pass from one age of the world into an older one, from the swift, sure, punctual certainty of the railway into the ancient, slow uncertainty of travel by sea. The train runs to its timetable, sure as clockwork, heedless of the weather. But once you are aboard the steamer and out upon the water, you are back in the hands of the wind and the tide and the sea. As all travellers were before the railways came, your passage quick or slow, smooth or wild, safe or anxious, according to the temper of the Western Ocean that day. There is a romance in that, and a slight delicious fear, the sense of setting out over the deep toward a destination you cannot yet see, of trusting yourself to the old wild element that the railways, for all their conquests, could never tame. The islanders, of course, think nothing of it. The sea is their road, and they read its moods as a lowlander reads a signpost. But to from inland, there is always a quickening of the heart in that moment of leaving the solid pier and feeling the deck lift to the first swell of the open water. And so the harbour at the end of our line is not really an ending at all, but a beginning, a doorway, a place where one journey gives way to another, and the traveller may go on, if he wishes, out across the sea, to the farthest and most romantic corners of the West. We shall not go with him today. Our journey ends here, at the pier, with the train at our back and the sea before us, and the islands beckoning on the horizon. But it is good to stand here in the long evening and watch the boat set out, to see a little steamer cast off and swing her bows toward the open water and head away west into the gold of the sinking sun, bound for Skye or the small isles or some farther shore, growing smaller and smaller over the shining sea, until she is only a dark speck and a thread of smoke against the brightness, and then gone. It stirs something deep in the watcher, that sight, the old longing for the islands, the pull of the unknown west, and it is a fitting thing to carry with us into the evening and into sleep, the image of the little boat heading out upon the golden water toward the dreaming isles, away and away, into the last of the light. Let me tell you about that roadless country across the water, the rugged land you can see from the harbour, lying dark and mountainous beyond a deep sea lock to the north, for it is one of the last truly untamed places in all of Britain, and its very name has become a byword for remoteness. They call it the Roughbounds, an old name, and it deserves it, for it is a tangle of high savage mountains and deep glens and narrow sea locks, with scarcely a track in the whole of it then or now, a land you can enter only by boat from the sea or on foot over the passes, and once in, you are as far from the modern age as it is possible to get on this island. The sea lock that guards its southern edge is itself a wonder, a long arm of the salt water reaching far inland between the mountains, said to be the deepest sea lock in all of Europe, its black waters plunging down to depths to match the height of the hills that crowd about it. And its name in the old Gaelic means the Loch of Heaven, while the loch on its other side is called the Loch of Hell, the two of them christened, the story goes, by some old saint or traveller for the differing tempers of their waters. It is a region with its own sad history, the Rough Bounds, for it too once held more folk than it does now, and it too was emptied, its glens cleared, its townships pulled down, its families sent away over the sea, until almost nothing was left but the deer and the mountains and the silence, and yet a few souls cling on even here, even in the remotest corner of the mainland, in a tiny settlement on the shore of the loch that can be reached by no road at all, only by the boat from Mallaig, or a long walk over the hills, living there at the very edge of everything, beyond the reach of the railway and the wider age, in a corner of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary hardship and isolation. To live there is to choose a life apart, governed by the sea and the weather and the seasons, far from all convenience and all company. And there have always been a few in every generation who have wanted exactly that, who have looked at the trackless mountains and the dark loch and the lone settlement at the back of beyond, and felt not daunted, but called. There is something in us, I think, that needs to know that such places still exist, that there are still corners of even our own crowded island where the roads do not reach and the wild holds undisputed sway, where a person might stand on a beach and see no light of any other human habitation and hear no sound but the wind and the sea and the cry of the birds. The rough bounds beyond the water from our harbour are such a refuge, and were so for ages before our railway came, and will be so for ages after, for not even Concrete Bob and all his navvies could ever have driven a line into that fastness, and no one has ever tried. The railway has brought the modern world right up to the brink of the wild here at Mallaig, but it has stopped at the water, and past the water the old wildness begins, unchanged and unconquerable, the deer on the high tops, the eagle over the corries, the loch lying black between the mountains, the few hardy souls in their lonely settlement at the road's end and the world's end. It is good to look out at it from the harbour, that last untamed ground, and to know that it is there, and that some things, at least, the railways and the modern age have not been able to tame. Now that we have come right down to the sea, a whole new world of living things opens around us, the teeming abundant life of the western coast and the islands, and it is as rich and as abundant as the life of the empty mountains was sparse and hidden. The air above the harbour and along the shore is never still nor silent, for it is full of seabirds in their countless thousands, wheeling and crying and diving in a perpetual restless multitude. There are the gulls, of course, the herring gulls above all, grown bold and numerous on the leavings of the fishing fleet, screaming and squabbling over every scrap, but there are far more than gulls. There are the great gannets, sweeping in on their long black-tipped wings from the open sea, folding suddenly and plunging like white arrows into the water after the fish, throwing up little fountains of spray. There are the cormorants and shags standing sentinel on the rocks with their wings held out to dry, black and prehistoric. There are the elegant terns, the sea swallows hovering and dipping, the guillemots and razorbills riding the swell in little rafts, and comical and beloved, the puffins on the island cliffs with their absurd painted beaks, whirring out to sea and back, and in the water itself, and on the rocks at the tide's edge, there is life in equal abundance. The seals are the creatures you are most certain to see, for they are everywhere along this coast, hauling out on the skerries and the half-tide rocks to bask in whatever sun there is, or lifting their round dog-like heads from the water, to watch the boats and the train go by with an expression of such mild and soulful curiosity that it is no wonder the old people of these shores told tales of them as enchanted beings, seal folk who could put off their skins and take human form. There are two kinds along this coast, the common seal and the great grey seal, and their numbers are past counting. Their haunting, eerie singing, drifting across the water from the rocks where they gather, is one of the strange, wild sounds of these seas, a sound that has fed 1,000 legends. And out beyond, in the deeper water, move greater creatures still, the porpoises and dolphins that follow the shoals, rolling and leaping, the great basking sharks that cruise the summer seas with their mouths agape, harmless giants, and now and then, far out, the spout and the dark back of a passing whale. It is a coast brimming with life then, for all its wildness, perhaps because of its wildness. The cold, clean, teeming seas of the west, rich with fish, feed this vast multitude of birds and beasts, in a profusion that the tamed and crowded south long ago lost, and there is a great gladness in it, after all the human sorrow we have travelled through, all the cleared glens and the lost causes and the fading songs, for here at the sea's edge, the sheer abundance and energy of wild life reasserts itself, indifferent to all our human history, gloriously alive. The gannets plunge, the seals sing on the rocks, the puffins whir out to their fishing, the whole coast pulses with the ancient rhythms of the wild sea, as it did before ever a gale set foot here, as it will when all our doings are forgotten. To sit at the harbour's edge in the long evening and watch it all, the birds wheeling home to the cliffs, the seals on the darkening rocks, the boats coming in across the golden water, is to feel the deep peace that comes from being for a moment a small quiet part of something vast and living and entirely beyond oneself. And the day is drawing on now, and the light is turning gold, and it is nearly time to rest. For all its beauty, this is a dangerous coast, one of the most dangerous in all of Britain, and the men who fish it and sail it do so always with the knowledge of the sea's power at the back of their minds. For the western ocean that lies so gold and gentle on this calm evening can turn in a few hours into a roaring grey fury that has claimed more lives along these shores than anyone could count. The Atlantic gales come in from the open ocean with nothing to break them, driving great seas before them onto a coast of reefs and skerries and half-hidden rocks, of narrow sounds where the tides race like rivers, of sudden squalls that can dismast a boat or drive her ashore before her crew can do a thing to save her. The fishermen of this coast go out, of necessity, in all but the very worst of weathers, in open or half-decked boats, far from shelter, after a catch they cannot live without. And every fishing community along this seaboard has its long roll of the drowned, its widows and its fatherless children, its memories of the nights when the boats did not come home, and the women stood watching at the shore in the storm for masts that never appeared. The sea gives this coast its living, and the sea takes its terrible payment, and the people of the West have always known the bargain and made it anyway, for they have no other. Against the dangers of the coast, men have set their lights, the lighthouses that stand on the wild headlands and the lonely rocks all along this seaboard, throwing out their beams across the dark water night after night to warn the mariner off the reefs and guide him safe to harbour. To build them, on those storm-lashed rocks and remote promontories was a feat of engineering and courage to rank with any railway, and to keep them, in the old days, was a life of utter isolation and unwavering duty. The lightkeepers living out on their lonely towers far from all society, tending the great lamps through every night and every storm, so that the light should never fail, because lives beyond counting depended on it. There is something deeply moving in the thought of those faithful lights, burning steadily out there in the wild gloom, kept by patient men through the worst the ocean could send, for the sake of strangers they would never meet, sailors far out on the black water, who would see the beam swing round and know where the danger lay and steer for home. The lighthouse is one of the noblest things that men have made, a pure act of care thrown out against the dark and the danger, and these western seas are watched over by a whole chain of them, faithful and unsleeping, all down this perilous and beautiful coast. As the evening deepens and the dusk comes on, those lights will begin, one by one, to wake far out across the darkening water, a wink and then another, and then a slow, steady pulse of brightness from some distant headland, and an answering gleam from a rock far out to sea, as the keepers kindle their great lamps for the night's long vigil. To watch them come alive in the gathering dark from the safety of the harbour is a strangely comforting thing, for all that they speak of danger, for each one is a sign of care, of human watchfulness set against the wild indifferent sea, a promise that even out there in the dark and the danger someone is keeping watch. The light is burning, the way home is marked. And there is comfort too, simply in the steadiness of them, the slow unfailing rhythm of the turning beam, sweeping round and round through the night. The same now as it was an hour ago, and will be at dawn, faithful, patient, unwearying. As you drift now towards sleep, you might hold that image in your mind, the lighthouse far out on its rock in the blackness, its great beam sweeping slowly, steadily round, over and over, watching over the sleeping coast and the black sea, and over you all through the night, so that you may rest and not be afraid. There is a particular quality to this western country that a traveller may not notice in a single day's passage, but that lies very deep in the life of its people, and it is a profound and serious religious faith, of a kind that has largely faded from the gentler south, but that here, in the Highlands and the Islands, still shapes the whole rhythm of their days. The people of this coast, the crofters and the fishermen, are for the most part deeply, austerely, unshakably religious, formed by a stern and demanding Protestant faith that takes the things of God and the soul with the utmost seriousness, and that gives to their hard lives a great underlying dignity and steadiness and depth. Their faith is not a soft or a comfortable thing. It is grave and plain and rigorous, suspicious of show and ornament and worldly pleasure, centred on the Bible and the sermon and the searching of the conscience. But it is real, as few things in the modern world are real, woven into the very fabric of their days, sustaining them through the poverty and the hardship and the perpetual danger of a life lived between the harsh land and the dangerous sea. Nowhere is this seen more strikingly than in the keeping of the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, which in this country is observed with a strictness that astonishes the visitor from the south. From the going down of the sun on the Saturday to the going down of the sun on the Sunday, all ordinary work and all ordinary pleasure simply cease. The boats do not put to sea, however fine the weather, however thick the herring. No fish is landed, no field is worked, no journey is made that is not strictly necessary. The people put on their darkest and most sober clothes and walk, often for miles, to the kirk, where they will sit through long, long services, the unaccompanied singing of the psalms rising in that strange, slow wailing, deeply moving style that is unique to these islands, a sound like the very voice of the sea and the wind made into music. And the rest of the day is given over to rest and to worship and to the quiet of the home, the Bible read, the children catechized, a deep and total stillness lying over the whole country, so that a traveller passing through on a Sabbath might think the land had fallen asleep or been enchanted into silence. To the outsider, it can seem a hard and joyless thing, this iron Sabbath, this banishing of all work and play for a whole day of every week, and there is no doubt that it could weigh heavily, especially on the young. But there is another way to see it, and it is worth the seeing. In a life of unremitting toil, of endless labour at the croft and the boat and the peat and the net, the Sabbath was the one day of rest, the one day when the nets were down and the work was set aside and a man might straighten his back and lift his eyes from the ground, a day of quiet, of family, of music and reflection and the things of the spirit, a deliberate weekly refusal to let life be swallowed up entirely by the struggle to survive. There is a deep wisdom in that, perhaps, that our own restless age, which never stops, which has abolished the very idea of a day set apart, might do well to remember. The stern faith of the West gave its people, along with much that was hard, this one great gift, a still point in the turning week, a day of deep peace laid down by ancient command over the whole striving country, when even the sea was left to itself and the people rested. And the silence of a Highland Sabbath, lying over the lochs and the hills and the empty harbour, is a silence quite unlike any other, a chosen and a holy silence, deep as the sea lochs themselves. This is a country thick with old beliefs, with a whole shadowy world of the uncanny and the otherworldly that has lingered in these remote glens and islands long after it faded from the busy south. And as the dusk comes down and the shapes of things grow dim, it is the natural hour to speak of it. For these are twilight matters, things of the edge of the dark. The people of the West, for all the sternness of their religion, have kept alongside it a vast and ancient inheritance of folklore and superstition, of tales of the fairy folk who dwell in the green hills, and must never be named directly nor offended, of a water horse that haunts the lonely lochs in the shape of a fine pony, and lures the unwary to a watery death, of the seal folk who put off their skins to dance on the moonlit shore in human form, of ghosts and omens and curses and charms, of the lights that foretell a death, of the spectral funeral seen upon the road before a real one passes. In the long dark winters of this country, by the peat fire, with the gale howling outside and the nearest neighbour a mile off across the black moor, such tales had a power and a reality that is hard to recapture in our well-lit age, and many an old person of these shores believed in them, quietly and entirely, all their lives. Strangest and most famous of all the old beliefs of the Highlands is the second sight, the strange and unwelcome gift, possessed by certain people whether they would or no, of seeing things before they happened, or far off, or hidden, of seeing, in a waking vision, the shroud about a man who was yet in good health, and knowing he would soon die, of seeing the empty boat come home, or the stranger at the door, or the coffin carried out, days or weeks before the event itself came to pass. It was no pleasure, the second sight, but a burden, a kind of affliction that came unbidden and showed mostly sorrowful things, and those who had it were regarded with a wary respect, half pitied and half feared by their neighbours. Whether there was ever anything in it, who can say, but the belief in it ran very deep in this country, strong enough that sober and sensible people swore to instances of it, and it remains one of the strangest threads in the strange old fabric of Highland belief, a hint of doors in the world that most of us never see, ajar in these lonely places where the veil between the seen and the unseen was always felt to be thin. And perhaps it is no wonder that such beliefs took root and flourished here, in this country of mist and shadow and silence, of empty glens and deep dark lochs and islands half seen through the rain, where the great forces of sea and mountain and sky press so close upon the little works of men, and the dark of a winter night is so very dark, and a person may be so very alone with the wild. In such a place the mind opens to the uncanny. The boundary between the real and the imagined grows thin. The old stories seem not so impossible after all. We who pass through on our bright modern train, full of our modern certainties, may smile at the water horse and the second sight, but let the dusk come down, and the mist close in, and the last light fade from the lonely loch, and even the most modern traveller may feel, somewhere deep below his certainties, an old stir of unease, a sense that this is a country where stranger things are possible than the daylight allows. Let the dusk gather then, and the old tales drift through the darkening mind like mist over the water, harmless and strange, as we settle deeper toward sleep. For they are part of this country too, part of the deep old dream of the West, into which we are sinking now as the day goes out. For all the hardship of life on this coast, and all the sorrow in its history, it would be quite wrong to leave you with the notion that this is a grim or a joyless country, for nothing could be further from the truth. The people of the Highlands and the Islands are famous, and justly famous, for a warmth and hospitality and a gift for companionship that the comfortable South can hardly match. And the warmth of a Highland welcome is a thing that travellers remember all their lives. In a country so poor, where so little could be spared, the sharing of what there was with the stranger and the traveller was held to be a sacred duty and a deep delight. No one was turned from the door, no one went unfed who came in need, and the poorest croft would give of its little freely and gladly to whoever crossed its threshold, asking nothing in return but the news and the company. There is a generosity in these old communities that grew perhaps precisely out of their hardship, out of the knowledge that in a hard land men must hold together and help one another or perish, that the door must always be open, because the day might come when it was you who stood outside it in the cold. And the great flower of that companionship was the sealith, the gathering, the old institution of the Highland evening, when the people of a township would come together of a winter's night in one or another of the cottages, crowding into the warm firelit room, and pass the long dark hours, not in idleness, but in the richest sort of company. There would be singing song after song, the old Gaelic songs that everyone knew, taken up in turn round the room. There would be the telling of tales, the long heroic stories and the ghost stories and the local lore, told by those who had the gift of it to a rapt and silent room. There would be music, the fiddle and the pipes, and very likely dancing, the reels and the strathspeys on the earthen floor. There would be talk and laughter, and the warmth of many friends gathered close against the dark and the cold outside. It cost nothing, the sealith, for these were people with nothing to spend. It was made entirely of themselves, of their own songs and stories and music and company, the inheritance of centuries freely shared, and it was by every account one of the richest and happiest things in the whole of that hard life, a warmth of human fellowship that those who knew it remembered ever after as something precious almost beyond words. It is worth holding on to, that image of the sealith, the warm, crowded, firelit room full of song and story and friendship, against the dark and the cold of the winter night outside. For it is the very heart of what was best in the old life of this country, and it is a kind of warmth that our own age, for all its comforts, has rather lost. We do not gather so, now of an evening, to make our own music and tell our own tales in one another's company. We have other things, easier things, that ask less of us and give less in return. But the memory of that older warmth lingers in this country above all, where the songs are still sung and the welcome is still warm and the door, often as not, still open, and a traveller who is lucky enough to be taken into a Highland home, even now, even in our own day, and given a seat by the peat fire and a dram and a share of the talk and the song, will feel something very old and very good, a warmth that goes back through all the hard centuries to the very root of what it is to be human together in a cold world. Carry that warmth with you now as the night comes on, the firelit room, the friendly faces, the old songs rising, the welcome and the warmth and the company against the dark. It is a good thing to fall asleep upon. Before the light goes altogether, let us think once more about this remarkable line that has carried us all this way, and about what it meant and means for the country it runs through, for it is a matter of more than one face, and its story holds both gain and loss, as the deepest human stories always do. On the one hand, it was, beyond any question, a great good to this coast, a lifeline thrown to a country that was dying. It brought the fish to market and made the fortune of the harbour at its end. It gave the crofters and fishermen of the West a way to sell what they had and to buy what they needed, and a swift new road to the wider world. It brought in the visitors and their money. It carried the young away to work and brought them home again to visit. It knit this remote and half-forgotten coast at last into the life of the nation. For a country bled white by the clearances, emptied and impoverished and left behind, the railway was a genuine renewal, a reason for hope, a refusal to let the West be wholly abandoned, and many a family stayed and made a living on this coast because the line was there, who would otherwise have had to join the long, sad exodus over the sea. And yet, as we have seen all along this journey, the railway was also, in its quieter way, an ending, the bringer of a new order that swept much of the old away. It killed the droving trade and the old slow ways of travel. It brought in the English language and hastened the fading of the Gaelic. It brought the tourist and the sportsman, and made of this living land in part a spectacle and a playground. It bound the West ever more tightly to the markets and the fashions and the rhythms of the distant South, until the ancient self-contained society of the Highland coast, with its own tongue and its own music and its own immemorial ways, began to dissolve into the general life of the modern age. The railway did not do these things out of malice, of course. It did them simply by being what it was, a thread of the modern world reaching into an old and separate place, as the new age always does reach, in the end, into what stands apart, until nothing apart is left. The line was a marvel and a blessing, and also, in its way, a kind of last farewell to the realm it opened up. That is the truth of it, the double truth, and there is no pretending it is simpler than it is. The West Highland line, this beautiful, improbable railway flung across the Wild West by Concrete Bob and his navvies, brought life to a dying coast, and at the same time helped to end a way of life thousands of years old. It was a triumph of the modern age, and an elegy for everything the modern age replaces. It is, like the lonely Highlander on his tower at Glenfinnan, a thing that looks both ways at once, toward the hopeful future and toward the lost and lovely past. And perhaps that is why a journey along it moves the heart so deeply beyond all its mere beauty, because the whole human story of gain and loss, of the new forever rising and the old forever passing, of hope and sorrow inextricably twined, is written along its 40 miles for anyone with the eyes to read it. We have read it today, you and I, all the way from the mountain to the sea. And now the reading is done, and the evening has come, and it is time to let it all settle into the deep place where the day's journeys go, and to rest. Let us pause now, here at the journey's far end, and think a little about the journey itself, about what it is, exactly, that makes a long, slow railway journey through beautiful country such a balm to the tired spirit, such a help toward rest. For there is a particular magic in it, and it is the very magic that has been at work on us, quietly, all the day long. It is partly the rhythm of the thing, that steady, regular, rocking beat of the wheels over the rails that has underlain our whole journey, the long roll and the soft double knock, again and again, hour upon hour, as regular as breathing, as regular as a heartbeat, so deeply soothing to some old animal part of us that travellers have nodded off to it since the very first railways ran. There is something in that gentle, endless rhythm that loosens the grip of the anxious mind, that rocks us almost, as a child is rocked, until the thoughts grow slow and heavy and the eyes begin to close. You have felt it today, surely, that pull toward drowsiness, that sweet heaviness, as the carriage swayed and the wheels beat out their endless soft tattoo beneath you. And it is partly, too, the particular way that a journey holds us, suspended and at ease, between one place and another. On a journey we are released, for a while, from the ordinary demands of life. There is nothing we can do, naught we ought to be doing, no task that can be begun, for we are simply being carried, helplessly and pleasantly, from where we were to where we are going. And the time between belongs to no one and asks nothing of us. It is a kind of holiday from the will, a permitted idleness rare and precious, and the mind, set free from its usual striving, drifts and wanders and rests, gazing out of the window at the passing country, thinking of everything and nothing, sliding by easy degrees towards sleep. The old anxieties lose their edge. The urgent matters of yesterday seem far away and small. There is only the window, and the moving country, and the rhythm of the rails, and the deep animal contentment of being carried safely onward through a beautiful world while someone else attends to the driving. That is the gift we have been given today. The gift this journey has been quietly giving us all along. Release and rhythm and rest. We set out this morning from the foot of the great mountain with the cares of our own time still clinging to us, and we have travelled all day through a country of overwhelming beauty and deep old sorrow, and somewhere along the way, between the empty glens and the great viaduct and the long locks and the coming of the sea, the cares have loosened and fallen away, and we have been rocked and soothed and carried into a deep and easy peace. The journey has done its old kind work on us, and now it is nearly over, and the evening is coming down, and the only thing left to do is to let that peace deepen into sleep. Stay where you are, in your seat by the window, with the rhythm of the rails still echoing in your bones, and let the long golden evening of the west fold itself around you, and let yourself begin gently to drift. And now let us stand for a last long moment here at the very end of the line, at the edge of the land, and look out and take in where our day's journey has brought us, for it is a spot worth standing in, and a moment worth keeping. Behind us lies the whole length of the railway, and beyond it the whole length of Britain, all the crowded, busy country we have left behind, threaded together by its iron roads, running away east and south for hundreds of miles to the great cities and the teeming millions, and we have come by this one slender line right out to the far western edge of all of it, to the last pier, the last rail, the place where the made domain of men runs out at last into the wild old realm of the sea. Before us lies the water, the open western sea, stretching away gold and grey toward the islands and the sunset and the immensity of the Atlantic beyond, the same wild sea over which the saints came in their frail boats 1,000 years ago, and the prince came and went in his hope and his despair, and the emigrant ships bore away the cleared and the grieving toward the far side of the world. We stand at the meeting place of all of it, the land and the sea, the old and the new, the realm of men and the realm of the wild, with the railway at our back and the ocean at our feet. It is a strange and moving thing to come to the edge of the land, to the place where the road runs out and can go no further. There is a finality in it, and a freedom, and a kind of peace. All the day we have been travelling, always westward, always toward this, and now there is no further west to go. not by land, not by rail. Here the journey ends, against the sea, at the edge of the world. And standing here, with nowhere further to go, the restless travelling part of the mind grows quiet at last. There is nothing to do now but be here, at the edge, in the evening, and look out at the sea and the islands and the failing light, and let the long day, and all its beauty and all its sorrow, settle slowly into stillness. We have come as far as we can come. The going is over. There is only the sea now, and the evening, and the deep peace of the journey's end. And all that we have seen and heard along the way seems to gather and settle, here at the land's end, into a single quiet feeling that is hard to name. The great viaduct and the lonely Highlander, the empty glens and the cleared people, the prince and the standard and the lost cause, the white sands and the blue islands, the songs and the seals and the lights coming out across the dark water, the whole long human story of this beautiful and sorrowful country, gain and loss forever twined together, hope and grief, the new forever rising, and the old forever passing away. It is too much to hold in the mind all at once, and there is no need to try. Let it all settle rather into the deep place below thought where the meaning of a day goes to rest, and keep only the feeling of it, the bittersweet, peaceful, grateful feeling of having travelled, for one long day, through a country that holds so much, and come safe at last to the quiet edge of it, with the evening coming down. Here we will rest. There is nowhere further to go, and no need to go anywhere, and nothing left to do but watch the light fade over the sea, and let ourselves at last begin to sleep. The evening is coming down now over the western sea, and it comes slowly, here in the far north in the summer, with a great unhurried tenderness, as though the day itself were reluctant to end so lovely a thing. The sun is going down at last into the Atlantic, away beyond the islands, and as it sinks it sets the whole sky and the whole sea ablaze with a slow, soft fire, gold and rose and amber, deepening toward crimson, the islands lying black and still against the burning west, the calm water all aflame with the reflected glory. The boats in the harbour swing quietly at their moorings. The day's work is winding down. The gulls are settling on the water and the rocks, and over the little port and the great sea and the dark mountains behind, there comes a deepening hush, the long peace of the Highland evening, as the light slowly fades. There is no more beautiful hour in all the day than this one, and no more peaceful, and we are here to see it, at the edge of the world, at the end of our journey, with nothing left to do but watch the colours burn and fade, and let the peace of it sink into us, deeper and deeper, as the dark comes gently on. So let yourself settle now, as deep and as easy as you can. You have travelled all the long day, from the foot of the great grey mountain in the morning to the edge of the golden sea in the gloaming, across the whole width of that wild and lovely land, and you are safe in this quiet harbour at the world's end, where the light is slowly failing in the west. Let the weight of the day, and of all your days, grow heavy now, and sink, and settle. Let your breathing settle, and deepen, and ease. There is nothing now but the evening, and the fading light, and a soft warmth folding itself around you like a plaid against the coming of the dark. Let your mind drift back, if it likes, gently and without effort, over the land we have crossed, not trying to hold any of it, just letting the images rise and fade like the last of the light upon the water. The little train waiting in the grey morning under the great mountain, the wild empty glens sliding by, beautiful and silent and full of their old sorrow, the long graceful curve of the viaduct, carrying us out high over the empty glen, and the lonely stone Highlander far below, gazing for ever down his long loch, the prince in the empty glen, waiting, and the pipes coming over the hill, and the Standard rising into the summer evening, the white sands and the turquoise sea, and the blue islands floating on the water, the seals singing on the rocks, and the eagle on the high wind, and the lights coming out one by one across the darkening sea. Let them all drift through your quietening mind, soft and far away now, the gathered images of the day, growing dimmer and gentler as you sink down towards sleep, until they blur and merge and fade, like the islands fading into the dusk, like the gold fading from the sea. And let the rhythm of the rails come back to you now, that steady, gentle beat that carried us all the day, the long roll and the soft double knock of the wheels over and over, even though the train is still and the journey done. Let it echo on in the deep of you, that soothing, endless rhythm, rocking you, gently, gently, the way the sea rocks the boats at their moorings, the way a child is rocked toward sleep. There is nothing to hold to, and no cause for fear. The lights are lit out on the dark water, sweeping their steady, faithful beams over the night, watching over the sleeping coast, watching over you. The lone Highlander keeps his patient watch over the silent glen, as he has for 100 years and will for 100 more. The peat fires glow low in the cottages along the shore, and the people of the coast are settling to their rest, and the deer come down quietly to graze in the cool of the gloaming, and the sea breathes low against the pale sands, in and out, the oldest and most peaceful sound in all the earth. And the long evening light fades, and fades by the gentlest of degrees, from gold to rose to grey to a soft, deep silver dusk that will linger half the northern night, and the islands sink into the dimness, and the first faint stars come out, very high and very far, over the dark mountains and the darker sea, and a great stillness lies over all the western world, over the empty glens and the silent lochs and the sleeping harbour and the wide quiet sea. The ancient settled peace of this old country come down at last upon the close of the day. You are a part of it now, that peace held within it, safe within it, at the edge of the land, at the end of the journey, at the close of the day, with the night coming softly down, and the rhythm of the rails still rocking, ever so gently, far down within you, and nothing left to do, and nowhere left to go, and all the long day's travelling done. Rest now, let go, sink down into the soft dark below, as the last light leaves the sea, and sleep mid-spot. If this long quiet ride out to the sea has been a help to you, a way of letting the day go, then you would be warmly welcome to rest here again whenever you have need of it. The old line will still be waiting, and so will I, and there is no cost and no hurry to any of it. But none of that is for now. For now there is nothing left to do, and nothing more to dwell on, and all the journey is behind us, and the night has come. Thank you for spending these few hours with me, here at the edge of the Western Sea, travelling the old railway through the country of the Prince and the empty glens and the white sands and the islands. It has been a pleasure to make the journey in your company. The light is gone from the sea now, and the night is soft and deep and kind, and you are safe and warm, and the day is well and truly over, and there is no more for you to do but rest. So let yourself go now, all the way down, into the quiet, into the dark, into sleep. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.